The aftermath of the IT meltdown at Southwest Airlines, lessons from 100,000 ERP case studies, and an overview of digital transformation. Those are just a few of the topics we're going to cover here today in episode 170 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. This podcast features technology agnostic and international discussions related to digital strategy, software selection, implementation, change management, business process optimization, and everything else you need to know to make your digital transformation project successful. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you. Now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 170. My name is Eric Kimberling from Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients through the world with their digital transformation journeys. And joining me as my host is Darian Chwialkowski. Darian, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Got a great show for you today, but before we jump in, a couple things. The show is produced by Major Tom Productions and sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, the company we work for. So be sure to check us out. You can go to thirdstage-consulting.com. We're technology agnostic and independent, and we can help clients like you through the digital transformation journey. So thank you for listening in here today. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can also listen to past episodes of this podcast by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com as well. We've got a great show for you today. We're going to dive into some audience questions and discuss the aftermath of the Southwest Airlines IT meltdown from a little over a year ago. So we're going to dive into sort of the aftermath of that and what some of the lessons are from that. And speaking of lessons, we're going to have Professor Hans Mulder on the show, who is going to be on discussing with me some lessons from some extensive research he's done into over 100,000 ERP and digital transformation case studies. So we're going to talk about what some of the quantitative findings are from his study there. And then later in the show, we're going to play you a clip of an interview that a company called Celigo did with me as part of their podcast. So we're going to share you this interview and this discussion that we had later in the show just to talk about digital transformations in general and what some of the best practices and lessons are there. So before we jump into our guest here today, Darian, what are some of the social media questions we've gotten here lately?
Yeah, so our first one is from your video about predicting failure in digital transformations. This comment is, I went 3 out of 4 projects ending in failure. No matter what, predicting failure is easy and the odds are in your favor. So I want to know, how can you actually predict success instead of failure?
That's a great point, because I suppose if the odds are stacked against you and it's 70 or 80% chance of failure, if you guess failure, the odds of you being right are pretty accurate. And it's a great point. How do you predict the ones that are successful? And I would say, if you do the opposite of what I talk about in that video, and essentially what I'm saying in that video is there's, I think, 5 or 6 things that when we see these things happen on a project, we know that it's likely to lead to failure. So the companies that don't do those things or do the opposite of those things are the ones that we would predict success for, especially if you do all 5 of those things correctly. If you're doing all 5 of those things correctly, the odds of you succeeding are extremely high. The problem is most organizations don't do those 5 things. So it's a great question, and I'd say that's probably the easiest way to respond to that is just don't do what I talk about in the video, because those are the problems that cause the failure.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Our second question today is from TikTok, I believe, and it says, you are so far off here. CPQ is the new OE. The business rules are put in place to minimize downstream errors and reduces the need for tribal knowledge and training.
Yeah, I'm not sure which video it's in response to. Do you by chance know what the...
It was just a short talking about CPQ.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, I agree with this person and how they describe CPQ in OE. Let me just back up for a second. OE stands for order entry. CPQ is configure price quote, which is part of order entry for complex manufacturers or anyone that sells like a complex make-to-order sort of product. What happens with CPQ is it puts business rules in place that sort of define for your customer service reps or your sales reps defines for them what they can and can't sell. So in other words, if they're talking to a customer or a potential customer and they are entering in their system some sort of configuration or requirements or specs of what a customer is asking for, the system will tell you if you can't do that. So in other words, if there's certain things that just logistically can't be built or variations that can't exist, those business rules will help drive the customer service rep or the sales rep to make sure they enter those appropriately. And so CPQ is a tool set or a functionality, or in some cases a separate module within order entry and manufacturing and even distribution types of systems that allow you to put those business rules in place and make sure that people that are on the front lines taking orders are putting the right parameters, the right variations of your product in place as they enter it. So totally agree. If you've got a CPQ tool, that ends up becoming your order entry system, essentially. I mean, because standard vanilla order entry typically isn't going to get the job done because it's not going to put those parameters in place for you. So agree with that person. I'm not sure what I said to offend them or make them say that I was wrong. I'll admit it, I was wrong if I said something other than that, because that is true from what this person's saying.
Okay, so don't be so hard on him. He's admitting.
Right, I'm admitting guilt of whatever it was that you're telling me I said wrong.
Our next question today is from Bobby B. Lone Tree on TikTok, and it's actually about AI, our hot topic on this podcast, it seems like, but it's AI has existed for years now. How did the big leap happen? Does ChatGPT deserve all the credit here?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I was just talking to someone, or I was actually speaking on a conference panel last week, and on the panel, someone was saying that they asked the question to the audience, like, how many of you have been using? I think they were talking about either Amazon or Facebook. I can't remember. It's one of the big tech companies that's been around for a while. They said, how many of you have been using Amazon or Facebook? A bunch of people raised their hands, and then he says, then you've been using AI this entire time, because Facebook had the algorithms to determine what shows up in your feed, and through all the Facebook ads and things that you've been getting for decades now. That's AI. And same with Amazon, when you get those recommendations of, based on your past buying behavior, these are some things you might like. That's AI as well. And so, the point there is that AI has been around for a long time. It's sort of been on the back end, behind the scenes, that a lot of people haven't seen. And it's typically just been the big tech companies that have been investing in AI, which makes sense because they've got the resources to do it. But I do think, I agree with Bobby B., which has a nice ring to it, by the way. Bobby B. It sounds like a singer or something, or a celebrity of some sort. So maybe it's someone famous that's asking this question. I don't know. But in that question, there's some interesting points, or an interesting point about ChatGPT. And I do think that ChatGPT deserves the credit for bringing AI to the mainstream, for sure. I'm not saying ChatGPT is like the premier AI tool by any means, but it's the one that I'd say most consumers know of, just because it sort of blew up into the mainstream and even pop culture here recently. So I think ChatGPT deserves the credit, not for making AI viable necessarily, but just making it more accessible and more on the forefront for the average consumer.
Yeah, definitely. Some really good social questions today from our audience.
Yeah, as always, there's always tons of great questions, and we try to get to as many as possible. So wherever you follow me or our company, be sure to drop in the chat, or wherever you are connected, drop a question for us, and we'll pick up as many as we can here for this episode. We're going to take a really quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the aftermath of the Southwest Airlines IT meltdown. We've covered in this podcast a little over a year ago. We talked about the Southwest Airlines meltdown a little over a year ago, where a bunch of people got stranded, a bunch of canceled flights, largely because the IT systems and an upgrade didn't go well. So we're going to talk about that here in just a moment. And then we're going to bring Hans Mulder on the show after that to talk about his lessons and his research from over 100,000 ERP case studies. And then finally, we'll have an interview and a panel discussion, talking about just an overview of digital transformation and what makes them succeed. So be sure to stick around. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control. I recently published my first book. It's called The Final Countdown, Strategies to Reach the Third Stage of Digital Transformation. And I wrote this book because I really wanted to find a concise way to share some of my knowledge around digital strategy and how to get started on a digital transformation journey. So in this book, I cover 3 different sections. I cover the people, process, and technology aspects of transformation, with the idea that it's meant to be a starting point, a launching pad for organizations and team members that are going through digital transformations. So I encourage you to buy this book. You can get it electronically, you can get it paperback, or you can get it in hard copy as I'm holding here in front of you. You can get it by going to thefinalcountdown.com. You can also search for it on Amazon if you shop at Amazon. Otherwise, just go to thefinalcountdown.com. Love to hear your feedback on this book as well. So I hope you check it out and hope you enjoy.
I'm excited to share our newly released 2024 Digital Enterprise Operations Report. This free download is available on the Third Stage website at thirdstage-consulting.com. This report is truly packed full of technology-independent and agnostic insights for your project to ensure that you're strategically optimized for success. Download your copy today with the QR code in front of me or visit our website for more details.
These things take time, Mom and Dad, they have a good life. But what am I gonna do with mine?
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 170. My name is Eric Kimberly, here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is produced by Major Tom Productions and sponsored by Third Stage Consulting. So thank you for being here today. So Darian, the Southwest Airlines IT meltdown from a little over a year ago, you've got an update for us. What's going on with Southwest Airlines?
Yeah, so like Eric said, we obviously talked on this podcast, or Eric talked about on this podcast a year ago about the meltdown that was widely due to the outdated software systems that they had. But now throughout 2023 and now in 2024, they have implemented some new technology to really avoid this situation from hopefully ever happening again. This technology, they named it Cario. It stands for a tool that's called Cario. It's Crew and Aircraft Integrated Recovery and Optimizer. And so apparently to Southwest, they quote that it's the first kind of software of their kind for the airline industry. It enables them to automate, prioritize, and reset the crew and aircraft networks simultaneously and flag potential flights that might need to be canceled, while also minimizing the potential impact on crew members, so that way crew members don't get stranded somewhere like they did or don't get placed on flights like they need to in 2022. So with all of this to be said, they have implemented some new technology that hopefully improves the overall customer experience with Southwest, and they said that it has been going very well. Seeing this article and the new implementations, it triggered some questions for me, Eric, that I want to ask you about. If you have ever seen something similar to this Southwest meltdown where something happens due to outdated technology or them needing to go through a transformation, or if they're even going through a transformation, just not implemented completely yet, and then something bad like this happens for the business, and then what the aftermath of that looks like for any other examples that you have seen.
Yeah, well, first of all, I have a question before I answer that. Is the system what's it called again? Cario or? Yeah,
Cario. I think it's just like
Cario.
The CAIRO.
Okay, so is that the system? Is that the same system they tried to deploy when they had all the problems a little over a year ago, or is this in response to that meltdown that they're?
I believe it's in response to the meltdown. So they implemented this in 2023.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, that makes more sense. Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunately it's very common to have a system implementation and a go live in particular create operational disruption. In fact, our team for over a decade now has been tracking a number of different metrics in the space as far as research and understanding what actually happens with digital transformations and what the actual results are. And one of the most stable results in our research over the years has been the percentage of companies that experience some sort of operational disruption. And it's hovered right around 50%, 50 to 52 or 53%, I think is sort of the range of where most years that number comes in. And when we talk about operational disruption, it's sort of like, we don't mean like, hey, it was a little bit choppy at first, or hey, some people had trouble logging in or getting used to the system, or we weren't quite as productive as we were, over time. But instead, what it means is that no, there was a material operational disruption. Like we couldn't ship product, we couldn't close the books, we couldn't run payroll, we couldn't manage our airplanes and our crews and all that other stuff, as is the case of Southwest. So unfortunately, it's about 50-50 that companies have some sort of problem like Southwest had. Now, of course, some problems are bigger than others, and when it's Southwest Airlines or any sort of major transportation carrier or public-facing sort of organization, it's going to feel more dramatic than the average company that produces widgets or whatever, and you wouldn't necessarily know if they had the IT failure, and you wouldn't hear about it in the news necessarily. But it's about half of them that have that sort of problem, so it's extremely common, I hate to say. But I also think that there are things that organizations can do to essentially guarantee that you don't have that problem. You may have other problems. You may extend the project. It may run over budget, that sort of thing. But to me, the one thing you should never do is go live with the new system and have that sort of reaction or response as Southwest had. And there's risk mitigation measures you can put in place to catch those things and to stop the project or to ensure you don't go live when you're not ready for it. Unfortunately, most organizations just sort of look past that stuff and go live anyway.
Yeah, you kind of stole my question there, but I kind of want to touch on that further on for companies like Southwest or a major public transportation or any companies that are public facing that could really affect people in their day-to-day life, like getting travel canceled or something like that. What are some of those risks that those types of companies need to look out for before they even think about implementing something?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's what I do. By the way, I steal questions from people, so that was all intentional. But the things that you can do. I mean, first of all, and I'd say at the summary level, there's a go no go decision that needs to be made, for any sort of cutover or implementation, and that go no decision and checklist should include, basically all the showstoppers, all the things that you can't have happen in a project. And it should also include all the things that absolutely need to be completed before you go live. And it would include things like, have we fully tested the system? And when I say tested, I don't mean just the technology. Does the technology work? But have we fully tested it from the user acceptance perspective and or conference room pilots, depending on what nomenclature you and your implementation team use. But essentially what you need to do is ensure that you've tested all the different business scenarios and processes and workflows. You've tested that, you've validated that it works and that it captures and data flows the way it needs to. Needs to have been done. You also need to have made sure you've tested the data within the new system, which that's an area where a lot of companies fall flat, is they test the system's working great, but they don't test the mass amounts of data that they're going to put into the system until they go live. And then all of a sudden the data makes the system crash, or it creates other issues that they didn't anticipate because they never tested the system with all the data in the system. So just all kinds of things like that. You have to make sure that you've met these minimum thresholds. And if you haven't tested all your core scenarios, for example, if you can't just rely on faith and luck and say, well, we tested most of them. We tested 80%, but there's 20% of the critical processes that we haven't tested yet, but it should be fine because the technology works. So how bad can it be? If you have that mindset, you go live anyway. That to me is unacceptable. You've got to say, no, there's no harm in us testing that process or that other 20% that we might have missed. There's no harm in us taking a little bit extra time to go through that process to test it. I think that's all critical. Just to give you one, because you asked for an example, there's one that was earlier in my career that stands out just partly because I was younger and still learning quite a bit at the time. I'm still learning today, but I was learning even more so back then. But it was also the first project that I had really managed myself. It was when I had just started my previous company, and it was when I was still doing a lot of the project management, or I had just started doing a lot of the project management. And in that project, the company had requested a lot of customization from the software vendor, and they kept sort of changing their requirements, which is fine. It was all stuff they needed, and they were a complex manufacturer, and the system couldn't do everything they needed it to do, so they had to customize some stuff. And we had delayed the project twice already, so it had gotten delayed a few months. I think like an 18 or 20 month implementation. It had been delayed, 2 or 3 months maybe. So not a huge delay, but we were past schedule, right, because of some of this customization and just working through some of these issues. And there was some customization that was being developed late in the process that hadn't been fully tested and vetted. In fact, it hadn't even gotten past the technical test phase yet to make it onto the user acceptance test phase. And so we had suggested, when I say we, my company, my team and I had recommended, like, to the CEO and to the board, we said, we highly recommend you delay this project 30 more days. And it was going to cost, I think, like, if I remember correctly, it was $65,000 or $70,000 more to extend for another month and add 30 days to the timeline. And this is for a fairly, smaller, mid-sized manufacturer, so they weren't a huge company, and they didn't have a huge budget. So, but 65,000 was a fair number, or a fair amount at the time. And the CEO said, no, we've already delayed this twice. We're not delaying again. We're going live. And so, we said we don't advise it, but if you do decide to, obviously we're going to keep marching along with you to help you through it. And then they went live, and what happened was they couldn't ship product for months. I mean, it was about, if I remember correctly, it was just around $10 million of canceled orders that they just couldn't ever recover. And that $10 million translated to close to $1 million of net profit that they lost. And these aren't like delayed customer orders that just got pushed out. These were completely canceled because they just couldn't deliver the product on time because of some of these issues they had with the customization. So I look at that and say, okay, they saved $65,000 or whatever it was by not delaying again, but they lost $1 million in the aftermath as a result of that. And so I think that's what companies like Southwest and others need to do, is say, we're not just looking at the cost and the time for the implementation itself. We have to look at the costs and the risk and the impact of post-implementation as well. And if that has a high risk there, you've got to spend more time, and you want to invest more in the implementation to make sure you get it right before you go live. So, that's one example, and that's just some advice that came away from that example.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example of just showing that you may have to pay a little bit up front, but it's going to save you money in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. So good stuff. A lot of good lessons there from Southwest. I'm glad to hear they've figured things out, hopefully, and they've got some new technology to help them through that. And, we all feel the pain of that and hear about it when a big airline has problems, especially when it's during the holidays, which was the case here with Southwest Airlines. So great discussion there. And we talked about, speaking of case studies and data and research and some of the stuff we've been talking about here so far, we're going to bring on a professor from the University of Antwerp. His name is Hans Mulder, and he is an expert and a practitioner within the world of digital transformation and ERP implementations. And you may recognize Hans Mulder from I believe it was episode number 167, if I remember correctly. He was actually on a clip that we played where we had talked about, I actually met with him while I was in Amsterdam, and we had a small clip that we played for you back in episode 167 while it was in person. And so it was a shorter clip, but I wanted to have him back on the show as sort of our main guest to really dive into some of that research in a little bit more detail. So we're going to dive into some of these lessons from over 100,000 case studies that he's tracked in his database, and a lot of lessons that come from that. And we're going to talk about what some of the research and the data shows in his research. And then later we'll have the interview with Celigo, which is a technology provider that had me on their podcast recently. We're going to play you that clip of that interview just talking about digital transformation best practices. So be sure to stick around for both these conversations. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So, collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 170. My name's Eric Kimberling here at Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of the show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is produced by Major Tom Productions and sponsored by Third Stage Consulting. So thank you for being here today, and excited for our next guest who was just on the show a couple weeks ago. We played a clip of an interview that he and I had a few weeks ago when I was in Amsterdam, and I believe this was episode 167. We sort of skimmed the surface or did a flyover view of some of his research of over 100,000 case studies in that conversation. So I wanted to have him back on to really dive deeper into this and really unpack some of the research and quantitative findings that he has from his database of over, I think it's 130,000 different case studies. I'm going to let him describe it in a little bit more detail. But with that all being said, Professor Hans Mulder from University of Antwerp, thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's an honor to be here. And it all started many, many years ago, even before I was born. My dad was a pioneer in the IT. He started in the 1960s, and then he chose to collaborate with the Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC, in Boston. And he had the idea that it would be great if software could be reused as package. So he was actually one of the early adopters of the enterprise resource planning software approach. And I learned a lot from him, of course, while working in his company. But also we encountered another law, Eric, the law of Murphy. When it can go wrong, it will go wrong. So that led me and my dad towards the court cases, not as a party, but as an expert witness to testify or to do research, doing expert reports for the courts in the Netherlands about the failed projects. And for me, that was very difficult because what was my experience? It was limited. So I looked for a statistical basis. And once again, I came to Boston because in Boston in 1994, the Stennis Group was founded, and they were the first research company who did statistical analysis on IT projects. And each year they took about 5,000 of those case studies, not questionnaires, real case studies. So they called and they asked the manager, how did the project go? And they asked the finance department, how did it go on budget? And that led to the chaos reports of the Stennis Group. And now, after 25 years, so more than 100,000 case studies, we said, well, now it's okay. We have done enough. So we wrote a book about it, and it was called Chaos Reports Beyond Infinity. And that is what I'd like to talk with you about the experiences of that court cases, my personal experiences as a son of one of the first pioneers in ERP, but also about court cases. So perhaps you can have a discussion about that, Eric, because I know you are in the same league.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's really interesting that you have about 30 years of case studies that you've been able to collect and analyze over the years. And I'm gonna actually bring this question from the audience first, just because I think it's something that might be on some people's minds right now. This is from Yaku on YouTube. He says 100,000 plus ERP implementations sounds like it's pushing it. So I think the question that some of us might have is, how did you possibly capture 100,000 case studies? And you sort of just described it here just a moment ago, but maybe tell us a little bit about, you started to describe this, but maybe tell us a little bit more about the research and the data that you collect in these 100,000 case studies. And first of all, how did you get to 100,000? Maybe we could start there and then we could talk about the data.
But that's the reason I started in 1994, because you cannot do it in 1 year. So you have to do it on a, let's say, on a year-by-year basis. So the case reports are bi-yearly. And then we, of course, collect about 5,000 to 10,000 case studies. So we have a lot of time. So we had 25 years to come to that number. So it is correct that really pushing that. But also, I think we have a group of experts. So it is not done individually. It is a group of experts. And they bring in the case studies themselves. And we also have people to work for us to collect those case studies. And the most interesting, I think, is that we didn't focus on the answers. We much more focus on the dialogue. So like we called the general manager and he said, well, how did the project go? Okay, I think it was in budget, it was on time, but you have to call the finance department. So we called the finance department, yeah, it was on budget. And then we called one of the employees and we asked, how did the system run? Well, we don't use it. So for us, it was a kind of idea that what is success? What is success in regard to projects? And then we also had things like, yeah, the project was over budget, 10% more than we expected. However, it was very valuable. Now, is it a successful project or is it a challenge project? So for me, those definitions were much more difficult than we thought from academia. And also it led us to discuss the concept of success, because success now is on time, on budget, on target. But what does that on target mean? It means that you are going to deliver something which you discussed about in the past. Well, if you have a very small project of 3 months, it's fine. But in the Netherlands, we have projects for the government, for instance, who take more than 6, 7, 8 years. And what you get delivered on target is most likely not what you need now. So we changed the definition in the standards group to satisfactory. So you're not going to measure the cost of the project as such, of course, time and budget. But you're going to ask people who are working with project results, how does it work in your company? How does it work for your partners, for your customers? And that means that we shifted from measuring by, let's say, the delivery of the project towards the adoption into the organization. And that is a very much more disturbing fact, that it is not that successful. So delivery on time and budget on target can be done. But really adding value is something which is more important, I think, because that is the reason why you put in $1, you want to have $2 back. But we see that is the opposite sometimes. So yeah, for me, that is how the research was conducted. We didn't only do those case studies. We also, of course, had our experts reports where we were asked by the courts to do the analysis. And that led to all kinds of different perspectives as well. So one of the things I also want to talk to you about is decision latency. Decision latency, sometimes if you have a big project, you want to have more time to make a good decision. But the longer it takes to make the decision, the results are not better. So it is even better to have a fast decision and then reverse it if possible, than having a 2-3 months time waiting for the right answer. So for me, this was very helpful. Standish is a market research company, so that is only one part of my, let's say, affiliation to the university. So next to the market research, which is done globally, I'm also focusing really on things like architecture, enterprise architecture, governance. So for me, it is really needed to have the relevant cycle in place. And there is lots to be done, because I brought, of course, the book with me, the book of the Standish Group. And it's almost a flat line. And the flat line means that we didn't improve that much towards the success of the IT implementations. And at first I was thinking, we didn't make any progress. How is it possible? Because we went from waterfall in the 90s towards agility. So what happened? And there was another law, not the law of Murphy alone, but the law of Moore, who passed away, unfortunately, this year. And he said every 1.5 years we can increase our ambitions. And that is also what happens. So when we were looking at the 90s, we saw ERP being focused internally, most likely in the organization. And when you have a big organization, you were looking at multi-warehousing and those kinds of things. Now, and we're looking at the 20s, it's all about the ecosystem. It is not just the ERP system as a standalone in your organization. It has to connect your entire ecosystem. So we are increasing our possibilities, the law of more. And of course, when you do more, more can go wrong. The law of Murphy.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting. You hit a lot of really interesting points there. First of all, I think it's super interesting your discussion around how you categorize or how you describe success versus failure. So, for example, you could finish on time and on budget, but not deliver business value. And I think what you're saying is that would probably not be defined a successful project just because you finished on time on budget. But conversely, if you run moderately over budget or moderately over time, but you deliver a tremendous amount of value to the organization, then you might categorize that as a success, even though you might have spent a little bit more time and money than the other example. So I think that's very interesting. The other thing too is, I've always felt this through my career, but you're the first person that I know that has quantified this or based it on fact and research, which is that decision latency. So in other words, that the decision-making time, and you think about all these little decisions and some big decisions that have to be made throughout a project. And if you're taking a long time to make these decisions, you're slowing everything down. You're causing the meter keeps running, like your cost keeps going while you're making these decisions. And that you can see how these quickly can get out of control with budget overruns, time overruns, and things of that nature. So I think that's a really interesting point that's worth investigating. What were some of the biggest findings? You mentioned decision latency is sort of a big finding as far as what could cause success versus failure. But what are some of the other major themes in the research you've seen over the years?
Well, as a lecturer, as a professor, it is very healthy to look at this data because we all learn the students to follow the business case. If you are on the business case, you are the right project leader and doing a good job. But unfortunately, the data shows something different. The data shows if you keep away the farthest from the business case, the highest value can be achieved. And I thought the data is not right. This is not correct because we all learn to stick to the business case. But again, here it's on target defined perhaps many years ago. So you should look at business case management. You should look at, can we increase the value during the project by making other choices, other decisions? So for me, that was very healthy to see that the business case was something like, well, you shouldn't do it as a one-time only start for your project. You should use it on a continuous basis and try to increase your value during the project. That was one of the things I was really looked at the data. Another thing is that we had to had a new category because I think 2010, 2012, we didn't have any waterfall project anymore. Nobody was able to present us the waterfall projects. They were all agile. And then, of course, we had agilification. So we called the different organizations and we asked them some simple questions. Do you have stepping stones? Are you delivering continuously? Well, yeah, we have the daily stand-up and we do have the PowerPoint presentations. But at the end, we will do it as a big bang. So we wrote a paper about it, Jim Johnson and I, about the big bang boom. So that is not considered by us as an agile approach because at the end, you are still in the adoption of a huge implementation. So we had agile in name only as a new category we needed to define because it is used on several levels as agility. But really, if you're looking at iterations or you're looking at sprints or you're looking at all those people over documentation things, they were running the different direction. So for me, that was very interesting to see the data. Another thing was that we are focusing on projects actually. So a project has an end and has a beginning, but we also saw a new, no, not a new approach, but a different approach, which we first defined as modernization. So you keep your infrastructure, but you have to change some parts of it, and then you refactoring your code, and you're going up. And then we said, hey, how is it possible? We don't have any failures. And failures is an interesting definition. Failure is you are not delivering, or you are not using it. But if you're doing modernization, you're always using it on a daily basis. So you cannot go on a certain threshold. It is always like you are using it day on day basis. So then we thought, well, that's interesting. So that is actually a non-project approach if you do a modernization. And that was the thing which we are working on now. And to make a distinction between waterfall and agile projects, we talk about flow. It is really still in research, but I think it is interesting because flow means that you have projects of a day. And actually, I said to Jim Johnson, that's interesting. My dad, when he was working in the 1960s, they only had one computer in the company because it was expensive. And during the day, it did the production. And then they were doing the analysis, and they were asking the users what they wanted to have. And in the evening, they were coding. And if the compilation was okay, then they had new code the next day, and they could learn all the users how to use the new functionality, and then it started over again. So actually, in the 1960s, it was fresh code each day. So I thought, actually, that are projects of a day. And now I think with the new, let's say, capabilities we have, like the systems which are really generated from models, or systems that are generated with the help of AI, or let's say the real sound approaches on software quality. Why can't we go back to the days that we had projects of a day? Because if I lose one day, I only lose one day. But what I see, especially in government, that we lose 6 years, we lose 7 years. And that is, of course, very difficult for people, for their image, for their, let's say, for the reputation. And they don't want to stop that, of course. Well, perhaps there are better ways to create value. So now we are on a, let's say, on a quest to look for projects of a day. And you can also call it flow, because also in other industries, it's happening. And like the automobile industry, this Kaizen, each day continuous improvement. I think that other industries are also in that habit. But of course, there is a catch-22. You cannot have a modernization approach without having the platform. So there will still be a project to have that in place. And that is very hard, especially if you are a huge organization with a huge history and all the data has to be dragged along. That is difficult. And that we can see now. So we're working on that as well to make it a step-by-step approach. And that is what my fellow colleagues, professors, are doing at the University of Antwerp. And they call it evolvable systems. Evolvable systems in such a sense that you can keep up with the changes in the environment, in the functionality, but also in technology. And I think that is needed. We need to really address the problem of technical debt, because that really harnesses all the projects. They are so much, let's say, influenced by the technical debt that they are trying to overcome that by having more meetings. So we also see in the data that the meetings are growing again. So in the past, we tried to delimit that and to having more productivity, more, let's say, productivity in the sense of delivery on a certain frequency. We can now see that some projects, they almost spend all their effort on the meetings themselves. So yeah, there are some interesting stuff to talk about, Eric.
I'm here with Dr. Hans Mulder from University of Antwerp talking about lessons from over 100,000 digital transformation case studies. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control. People oftentimes ask me how I built such a strong social media following on YouTube and LinkedIn and Facebook and other outlets. And the fact of the matter is it took me a long time to build a following through a lot of trial and error, making a lot of mistakes. Had I known that there were companies out there that could help me build my brand, I would have done that a long time ago. I didn't know that, but the good news is that there is today a consulting firm that will help you through building your own personal brand through some of their training programs. The company is called Roloff Consulting, and if you're familiar with Emma Roloff, she's someone that I've had on this podcast before, and she's well known in the digital transformation space as well as the sales space, and she's big on TikTok, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And she and her husband have started a training course and a training company that focuses on helping people build their personal brands and helping them to sell themselves digitally. So whether you're a salesperson that's trying to reach more customers or you're an individual that's just trying to build your personal brand, that's something that they help with through their training programs. And they've offered listeners of this podcast a free 5-day LinkedIn challenge. And I encourage you to check it out. I've included a link below for this podcast. If you go to the podcast notes, you'll find a link that gets you free access to this 5-day challenge where you'll get step-by-step guidance. You'll get real results. So you'll get some tangible results from the program. And you also get a special offer at the end of it. So it's exclusive to listeners of this podcast. Be sure to check out the link below if you want to work on building your personal brand, or if you're in sales and you're trying to reach more people. Whatever the case may be, check it out. It's free to listeners of this podcast. You can check it out via the link below.
Interested in working for a company that truly values your unique skills and experience? Here at Third Stage, we don't hire based on resumes alone. We look at the full candidate, experience, and willingness to provide excellent service for our clients. Within a technology independent and agnostic consulting firm, you have the opportunity to learn across industries with a diverse group of clients. Our consultants also have the opportunity to diversify their portfolio and learn across technology systems. If you're interested in joining a high-growth entrepreneurial organization, please reach out to us at work@thirdstage-consulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 170. My name's Eric Kimberling here at Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new shows of this podcast every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And this podcast is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting. Thank you for being here today. We're here with Hans Mulder talking about lessons from over 100,000 case studies and some of the research he's done in this field over the years. It almost sounds like it's trying to find a hybrid or a balance between a big, massive transformation undertaking, but trying to break it down into smaller, bite-sized pieces. A lot like the agile mentality, but it's a slightly different take on that approach, it sounds like.
I'm very much in favor of agile, especially when you are looking at the learning capabilities of people and the adoption. But I'm also a fan of waterfall because as you are looking in the history, you can see that it also was very healthy to have go, no-goes. So I'm not against waterfall, I'm not against agility, but I think that we should also embrace the unexpected and the uncertainty.
Right.
So what I see most likely now is that we cannot figure out the next 5 years. What's going to happen in the next 5 years? Well, for my lectures as architect, of course, that is very interesting. Should we have a evolvable architecture or a composable architecture? Or you can see that that mindset also changes to things, how your definition of done looks like, for instance.
Right.
In the chat, I see a very interesting question, Eric. May I?
Yes, there's a few coming here.
Yeah.
And actually, before you pull up that question, if you don't mind, let me just say hello to some people that have dropped in the chat where they're joining from today. You have Johnson from Sydney, Australia. Thank you for being here on YouTube today. Franco from Minneapolis. Thank you for being here. Sanjana from the United Kingdom. Alcinda from Johannesburg, South Africa. Just a few examples of where people are joining from today. And then I have to show this comment just because it's a very friendly comment from Franco on YouTube. Says, hello, dear Eric. I love you. And I love you too, Franco. Thank you for being here today from Minneapolis. It looks like Franco's joining from Minneapolis. So we've got a few questions coming in here. Which is the one you wanted to start with here, Professor?
Well, I like the top 3 reasons for ERP failure or success. I was invited by Dutch Parliament for a committee, just as there was in the UK and also was in the States. And I was the first one to be heard by the committee. And they asked me, can you provide me with a top 3 of success or failure factors? And I said, yes, there are hundreds. There are hundreds of factors. But if I would condense them into 3, it's about people, people, and people. And that was the remark from the standards group. So technology is important. But I have seen beautiful ERP systems implemented awful. I have seen ERP systems which were not really suitable were implemented beautifully. So what we can see, if we have a good place, which is that the organization who is going to use the results of the project, if we have a good place, if we have a good team, and we have a good sponsor, those 3, then your chances of success are the highest. And it's not about the personalities, but about the skill. How skilled is your sponsor? How skilled is your team? the opposite is also true. If you have not a skilled team, if you have not a skilled organization, and you don't have a sponsor, well, then your chances are not that good. So for me, that looked at the human side, at the people side of it.
Right.
So because my dad started with ERP in the 1960s, I'm a fan of ERP. But that doesn't mean that they are all implemented on the right way. So next to the, let's say, the technology of the system, technology which is being used, it's also about the approach, how to implement it. And I've seen beautiful things, but I've also seen very strange things. Like, for instance, a US-based company, also with factories in Europe. They were all implemented on a beautiful ERP system, but they were locally implemented. And then somebody said, let's go for a global template approach, that we all have the same approach for the ERP system, and we can have less maintenance cost, we can have faster, swifter adjustments. We only have to look at the localization of that global template towards that factories in Europe and in America.
Yeah, that's
and
interesting.
the same system which was used first on a local basis now became the global, and it became a disaster. So for me, this is not about the system. This is not about, because the system works. So what happened? And then, of course, it has all to do about, do you know the differences between the different factories? Do you know how they are uniformed, how they are standardized? What is the way of communication between the different reporting? And that is, I think, what is most likely one of the biggest cases. It is not the technology part, but the way in which you make your network of commitments, your agreements, the way in which you are using the system. And for me, that was very interesting, because then it was a global project. And now we can see that it's not only within one global organization, but global organizations all around the world are connecting and to different means. So for me, that was the people part. And therefore, I like the question a lot about the 3 reasons. If you have good people, if you have a good sponsor, and you have a good team, your chances are much higher.
Right. So even if you have the best software that could possibly fit your organization, you have the best outside technical implementation partner, even with those 2 pieces in place, if you don't have those internal capabilities and skills that you're talking about, you're saying that you're not going to succeed most likely without having the sponsors that are skilled, the team members that are skilled, et cetera.
Yeah. This really something which caught my eye, that sometimes the systems are even better than the old systems implemented. But because of the way people are working, they say, well, the new system has different figures, different numbers, so it should be wrong. It should be wrong. Right. But it was more accurate when implemented. So it means that if you don't take into account the skill set of your organization and your team and your sponsor, the technology will only be for a part helpful. Well, one of the professors said, you have good systems, you have bad systems, you have good people, and you have, of course, not that good people. And with not that good people, nothing works. And with good people, it really doesn't matter. So it means that technology part is important, but please focus on the skill set. If you can do that, your chances will be even better. And most of the time, when I'm asked to do an opinion for the courts, I go to the specific factory or the office, and you want to talk with people. And that is much more enlightening than looking towards all the business cases and the reports, because you can hear, you can listen, you can see how they approach it. And that is another thing which I find very interesting from the Standish Group, and we call it emotional maturity. Because it are projects because of the fact that they can fail. So if you have a organization which says, we are not allowed to make any errors, that is not emotional maturity, because you will make errors. That is part of the project. Only you have to repair fast. You have to be swift on that part. But especially, again, in governmental sense, you are not allowed to make errors. But I think that's very hard, because if you look at children, how do they learn to walk? by falling and standing up again. So I think that the learning curve should be much more respected, and that will lead to a better adoption. But it also means that you have emotional maturity in your organization. And that is what I like also about the research of the studies group. We once had a very nice workshop with a marriage counselor. The marriage counselor said the Gotham Institute is able to analyze a relationship within 5 minutes and see what the chances are that they are still a couple within the coming 3 years, with an accuracy of over 90%.
Wow.
So we are asking, but how is it possible? How is it possible that you can, because that is marvelous, of course, also for your team setting. If you want to have a good team, you want to know if they are going along for the next 3 years. And that marriage counselor said, well, it's all about appreciation. You can see it already when they are talking to each other. If they appreciate and respect each other, that is very much an indicator that the relationship will hold. So now, instead of looking at the number of full-time equivalents and all the resumes, I'm looking towards how are they connecting? Do they know each other's first name? Are they interested? If it becomes very tough in the project, are they going to help each other? Because that are the things that really turn out to be of great importance of a good team.
Right. That's so interesting, because when you think about what organizations and project teams tend to focus on when they invest in what they think are the things that will make them more likely to succeed, they're more likely to invest millions or tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars in software, in the technical implementation, in, as you mentioned, getting more FTEs on the project. But it sounds like what you're saying is what organizations need to focus more on is just training themselves and maturing their organizations and their emotional intelligence and all that stuff. It's not really about the technology, which we can all learn. Anyone can learn technology, but that's the harder piece. That's the secret sauce, is what you're describing, the more intangible piece of it.
I love the question, and because it is so crucial, because I'm lecturing for my students. So I'm saying you have to do this and you have to do that, and that increases your chances. But looking at current research, the good sponsor is the most important independent factor of success. And that means it could only be 1 or 2 persons.
Right.
And that scares me, because it means that the success of your project could depend on 1 or 2 people. And if you're looking at it, it's also very logical. Because the good sponsor is the one who is articulating the vision of the organization, but actually is listening. It is not the project leader. It is the one who's listening and saying, hey, how are we doing this? And what is the organization in transformation doing? And trying to bond. And the good sponsor is something which for me was so new that I said to my fellow researchers at the study group, I have never read a book about the good sponsor. I know about the good team leader and the project leader, but what is it? So they decided to write a book about the good sponsor. And the good sponsor is actually not very much present. So we had a workshop with the Harvard Medical School, and we asked them, how much time does a good sponsor have? Well, I was very surprised, 3-4 hours a month. So what can you do in 3-4 hours, and why would it be so important? Because they know the organizational roadblocks for the digital transformation. They know where to look out for, let's say, falling off the cliff. And they are connecting the relations, the people in organizations who are making that transition happen. So when I saw that, I think this is not about project leadership on the IT project. This is the business transformation, actually, but then in the sense of the good sponsor. So. Right. And also other researchers, for instance, the Danish professor Bent Flyberg, he did a beautiful research about how big things are done. And he also came to the conclusion that thinking slow, acting fast of Kahneman, which is about thinking slow, is understanding it as a leader, what has to happen. And then during implementation, go fast. That first phase, the good sponsor, is of the greatest importance. So for me, that are still takeaways. I said, okay, we have to be very modest, because sometimes your success depends on picking the right sponsor.
I'm here with Dr. Hans Mulder from University of Antwerp, talking about lessons from over 100,000 digital transformation case studies. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control. Steve, we've chatted before, but remind me and our audience a little bit more about Epicor and where you're focused these days.
Hey, Eric, yep, good to talk to you, and thanks for asking. So Epicor, what we do is we make and sell cloud software for the global supply chain. And when I say that, when a customer purchases our software, we're committed to running their day-to-day business. And this would include everything from finance and procurement to production and sales. It's a responsibility we take very seriously, and it's something I believe we're very good at. We've got an employee base that has the deep expertise to understand their business and run their business. We also compete against 2 or 3 of the largest software companies in the world. So it's not good enough for our products to be good. They have to be consistently great, and that's a really important focus for me. So great products, deep industry expertise. We also focus on the essential workers that make those businesses run. We like to say Epicor's got you covered from the shop floor to the top floor. And when we say that, we really mean it. So that's Epicor.
It also suggests that you're not necessarily trying to be everything to everyone. You've got a pretty deliberate purpose and focus.
No, you're right. We really don't. So we focus on the make, move, and sell economy, which would really be manufacturing, distribution, and retail, like a retail operation. Well said. We don't try to be everything to everyone. We really do specialize and focus. And it is one of the secrets of our success. I guess it's not too secret anymore, but it's an area of focus for sure.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 170. My name is Eric Kimberling here at Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new shows of this podcast every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And this podcast is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting. Thank you for being here today. We're here with Hans Mulder talking about lessons from over 100,000 case studies and some of the research he's done in this field over the years. You know, you've got some people that are intrigued by this point as much as I am, Professor. WW on YouTube says emotional maturity is an excellent point. So thank you for that comment, WW. I have a question here I want to get to here too from Alcinda on LinkedIn. Alcinda says, curious to know the geographical spread of these case studies and if there's a pattern in how ERP is implemented in different parts of the globe or if the themes are generally similar across.
This is a very interesting question. And of course, most of the data we have from the Stanish group, about 60% is US, is Canada. I think that we are about 25 about Europe, and then we have Asia, which is actually much, much bigger than in the data we have. So I try to read some of those position papers, try to read some case studies, and I see very much differences. And the differences are within Asia, for instance, very different to compare. Like, for instance, Australia and New Zealand, they are more like the Commonwealth countries. So the data about the projects, how they are done, but also their failures, they are used to learn. So we can see that in Australia, we can see that in New Zealand. But it doesn't mean that there are no failures, for instance, in other countries in Asia. But they are not that much, let's say, as a learning capability. So, making a small joke, there are no failed projects in North Korea, for instance. They're all successful projects because the mindset is that it should be done on one way only, and then you just adapt and you adjust. But I can see that also there are some failure rates in Japan, and they are very much comparable to what we see in the US. But I think it has to do with the learning curve, that you can really learn from things and you anticipate on that. So I like the question a lot. It's very difficult, by the way, to get all the data because not, as I mentioned, everybody is willing to share the data from their projects. And also there is a different, and this is very important for Alcinda as well. I think, in where it is implemented. So most likely we are talking about, for instance, retail implementations. Well, they have better scores because you know the box is coming in, the box is coming out. If you're doing a policy making process for a government for a non-existing law which has to be implemented in 3 years' time, it's much harder. And so also here, and if you're looking at a really global scale, I would say that size is very much important. And I would say small, smaller, smallest. If you have a capability of making a small introduction and then implement and scale up, your chances are much higher. Because small also means in time, duration, very small. Yeah, there is a regional effect, but I think that size still outruns the differences.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm always fascinated by how different cultures in different parts of the world create different behavior and different risks and different opportunities. You know, for example, the difference between an organization or a geographic culture that is very hierarchical and structured versus one that's more independent and decentralized and free thinking. You know, you think about those two scenarios and how does that affect an implementation and how does that affect the chances of success and things of that nature.
You're somewhat right. We had a research on a merger, and that's interesting, especially if there are two different countries involved. It was a merger between a French airline and a Dutch airline. And the Dutch are very much salesmen, as you might guess. And they had the idea that an option on the cargo in the airplane was time based, which means that the last day the prices went up for delivery, for transport, because they were urgent things to be shipped by the plane. While in France, it was just the cubic, let's say, volume which was counted. Well then, if you are going to do a merger of two systems and you're not aware of the difference in language and the difference in applying that time-based approach to pricing, well, you get a lot of surprises. So what you see there is that the ERP actually also is the DNA of the organization. It's almost Conway's law, which is there in the system. And then you say, hey, this is the same field, the same attributes. Let's merge. Now that is, I think, where also culture comes in, because culture is a way of making agreements, and they are, of course, supported by the system.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting. And here's a question I want to get to too. I know you mentioned before, Professor, that the internal maturity and skills and capabilities of an organization, particularly the executive sponsor, are the key reasons or the key determinant of success versus failure. But you also need to, maybe to a lesser degree, you do need those successful or those effective outside partners. So I wanted to ask a question along those lines here. This is from Johnson on YouTube. Johnson says, what attributes, signs, or behaviors make up a good implementation vendor to help a business transition to an ERP? So in other words, have you done any research on the external factors or the external capabilities or variables from an implementation technical partner that might influence success versus failure?
Well, this is very interesting, because that is something which in my family was the case, as we were, of course, pioneers on the ERP. Also, my brother had an ERP company. And when we did implementation, we were the vendors, we were the partners. But actually, a project did cost us a lot of effort, attendance, but also time. The mindset should be of a partner that it is not the one part of implementation, it is the recurring revenues when you are using it the next 10 years. So a good partner takes into account that the project could be difficult, but that the best customer is the one who is using it for 10 years afterwards still. And I think that you can see in the way you are making your contracts. You can see that in the way you are arguing with your customer. My brother, for instance, I always thought that he made a quarrel with his prospects, with his customers. But what he actually was saying is, I take my responsibility for the system, you take your responsibility for your organization. And together we have to make it work. I cannot do it as just a vendor, as a partner, if you're not able to help your people changing the business processes. So we are making a good agreement here. I'm doing my utmost to make it success, but it also holds for your organization. And that was, I think, key, because you can, of course, say, well, this is a beautiful system, just turnkey, this is your budget, and it will be there in a year time. No. Because it is about the people in the organization, you have to be tough on the relationship up front, because you need each other when it becomes difficult. And I think that is, for me, very interesting to see that some partners are not understood that well. For instance, if you have a new technology, your pricing could be half or even a third of your competitors. And what is the response then, for instance, for an organization? Cannot be true. You are too cheap. That cannot be quality. And so there are some things you have to explain. And it is so difficult, because if you're looking at a car, you can see, well, that is a kind of class car I want to buy with that pricing. But actually, when you're looking at software, it is very difficult as a customer to value what is under the hood. So that means that you really have to go to the discussion about, what am I as a partner doing? I am investing in your organization for a successful project because I want to be a partner for the next 10 years. I'm not here for just the implementation. I think that, for me, was one of the things which was helpful to see when relationships were built in the ERP implementations.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So based on everything you've said so far and all these different variables that you've discussed and that you've done in your research, what percentage of implementations approximately would you say are qualified as successful versus failure? And I know you mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation that you have to define what success versus failure means. But if you use your criteria, how would you categorize the failure rate or the success rate?
Okay, so based on the data, we say the modern definition is on budget, on time, and the customer is satisfied. And then we make a distinction between the project-based approaches. So we have developing from scratch and build it yourself. We have developing by using components, and we have the purchased applications off the shelf. So, and then the off the shelf is the most successful. But mind you, that is 44% successful, which means on budget, on time, and delivering on satisfaction. So actually a valuable product as well, because the customer can use it.
Right.
And then there, of course, is a second category, which we call challenged. And challenge means, well, I did expect more, for instance. I expected faster. I expected, well, and that is about 36% on the ERP. And then we have a category which is called failed. And that is a very hard one for me as an expert for the course, because not using it is a failure. But does it mean that it is only directed towards the technology again? Now, it could also say something about the good place of the customer. Right. So in that respect, we have about 44% success, 36% is challenged, and we have a 20% which is failed. But that is an average. And you know, as statistics, averages can be really interesting, but also be very misleading. So what I did do, Eric, because we had this conversation today, I had a look at the database and I make the distinction between the ERP implementations below $1 million and above $1 million. And that is interesting, because then again, you can see if you have a project which is below 1 million, and I'm not counting the licenses, I'm not counting the equipment, I'm counting labor cost, I'm counting man years, because that is the most important factor, again, people. Right. So if you are counting about $150,000 for a year at work, it means that a project, which we call a small one, is below $1 million. It's about 6-7 man years, okay? Yeah. So if you have done that, your chances of success is 70%. 70%, yes, 70%. And only challenged 18%. So it means that small, again, is beautiful. And that is hard, because you know that ERP is actually the total systems approach of the 1960s. It is the enterprise resource planning software entirely. But if you can do the adoption on a based step-to-step approach, and you can get below that 6-7 man years of implementing, well, your chances are very good, very good. But if you're doing the opposite, and I've seen those of course in the court cases, you start with a budget of $100 million, your chances are not that good. So I think that is also, again, the good leadership, about good sponsoring. Know that you are emotional mature if you are not over ambitious, because that is not what people can handle. They cannot handle working on the system on Friday and then everybody on Monday is changing the world. That is too hard. So again, here the data shows that you have to be very much more precise. And as one of the people of the IT, I like this, because people saying it's all failure. That's not correct. That's not correct. There are beautiful things done, beautiful value. I would say if we turn out old computers now, we don't have any wealth anymore. So it is there to stay. But I think that we should be much more careful about the implementation and the adoption, because it is a human-centric approach.
I'm here with Dr. Hans Mulder from University of Antwerp talking about lessons from over 100,000 digital transformation case studies. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Just tell me what you've got to say. Tell me, I've been waiting for so long to hear.
I'm excited to share our newly released 2024 Digital Enterprise Operations Report. This free download is available on the Third Stage website at thirdstage-consulting.com. This report is truly packed full of technology-independent and agnostic insights for your project to ensure that you're strategically optimized for success. Download your copy today with the QR code in front of me or visit our website for more details.
Hi, this is Eric Kimberling with Third Stage Consulting and your host of Transformation Ground Control. I want to encourage you to read our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a free report or free guide that we published. It's one that I actually wrote that talks about best practices and lessons learned as it relates to change management. So as you know, on this podcast, we cover a lot of stuff related to the human sides of change, organizational change management, including training, communications, org design, all kinds of stuff as it relates to change management. So if you're trying to learn more about change management, or you're looking for more direction and ideas on how to get started on your change management strategy and your overall journey, be sure to check out this guide. You can read it by scanning the QR code on the screen in front of you, or in the links below for this particular podcast episode. You can find a link to take you to the page that will allow you to register to go ahead and download that and read it for free. So be sure to check it out. It's the Guide to Organizational Change Management, written by yours truly. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think, and hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 170. My name is Eric Kimberling here at Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new shows of this podcast every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And this podcast is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting. Thank you for being here today. We're here with Hans Mulder talking about lessons from over 100,000 case studies and some of the research he's done in this field over the years. What about the adoption of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and analytics, machine learning, predictive analytics, all kinds of different newer emerging technologies, Industry 4.0, Internet of Things? I've got a million buzzwords I can continue with, but I'll stop there. But what are the how are these newer technologies that are evolving in the ERP space? How is that affecting, or is that affecting the dynamics of implementation success versus failure?
It is. And of course, I'm very positive, but I also have to be very critical. So when we're looking at AI, I think that again, it is about also what is the synergy between, let's say, the people and the AI. And when I'm not really on the topic, I always try to figure out some way to get my research in place. So I define a master thesis project proposal. And then I always have students who say, I like to do that proposal. Right. So now I'm looking at the AI trias politica, which means that one AI system is producing, and it has to be done. It goes very fast. It goes on a nanosecond basis, and things are run beautiful. But there also has to be some control. So that is the second power of the trias politica. And that cannot be done by humans as well, because we are not always there 24 hours a day. We are not that fast. So we have two different educated language models which are connecting and trying to figure out if things are okay within some thresholds, and looking at the biases, for instance. And then there is, of course, a difference of opinion between the two AI systems. And then the human role is there to make a decision, an informed decision about what are our guidelines. How do we see this approach for our customers, for instance? What is the, and I think that is something which will change the ERP world in different domains. It will be in the implementation. So we would have much more different business model in place, which can tailor-made based for a certain value stream. I think that's possible. So that is on the implementation part, but also in the execution part, because ERP is very valuable for the execution part as well, and we have to monitor that. So I think on that respect, we can and we should use AI responsibly. Responsibly means that we take into account the human responsibility of being accountable for what is being done in our organizations.
Right. Yeah, very, very good point. And I know you shared with me a paper that you co-authored about the whole AI governance and your kind of thoughts on how you've got to have some parameters or guardrails in place for AI. And I imagine that's true not just at a macro society level, but also organizationally, you've got to set those same sort of parameters that are important to you as a business. Yeah, very interesting. Here's a question now. I'd be curious to get your opinion, Professor, and I'll share my opinion on this as well, because I have fairly strong opinions on it. This is from WW on YouTube. WW says, quick question. Would you approach procuring an ERP technology before or after functional and process convergence to drive the requirements of the business?
Beautiful question. I'm very much a fan of Taleb, which talks about the black swan and also writes about the anti-fragile world. And as I just said, I cannot be sure about what's happening in the next 3, 4, or 5 years. And that means that you cannot be complete on starting with all the requirements. So you need the competence to be flexible and adjustable. So that part, I agree with this statement that you shouldn't do it all up front as a grand architecture, knowing what is going to happen. But there are some things which you do need to know, and that is who you are and how you can do your current business. So, because otherwise you're going to make a deep dive without any safeguards.
Right.
But I like the question a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, one way to think about it too is not an either or proposition, but more of an iterative approach to where if you have, say, level one common categorization of business processes is level 1 through level 5. And level 1 is sort of the macro end-to-end process. Level 5 is the detailed, what screen do I go to? What fields do I enter? How do I enter the fields in a certain system? Very detailed, granular workflows. So if you think of it as level 1 through level 5, you're not going to go do level 5 early on before you pick the technology, partially because things change, as you mentioned, Professor, but also because it depends on what technology you're deploying. That's going to influence your level 5. But you can define, and you should define level 1 to maybe even level 3 of your business processes, where independent of what technology you use, this is how you're going to run your business, and this is how you want it to look in the future. And then when you pick the technology, then you go build out the details of level 4 and level 5, and you reconcile any misalignments or things like that. So that's one thing we've seen work really well with our client base as well.
This is very interesting, because what I also think is that we are not using the potential of what the system could offer. Mm-hmm. So we are so happy when we have done the implementation and we are running the system. But mind you, there is so much more possible within the boundaries of the system that actually you should not stop. You should go on, continue. And then you see it is a end. It is a long-term, short-term. It is a operational thing, but also a strategic thing. And what I find very a pity is that when we have done the implementation, we are not measuring the improvement in value. So we are again looking back towards what we have spent, What I would like to see is what we're going to earn with the system, what we're going to do. And the benefit tracking is almost not done in organizations. And if you have benefit tracking and you can see, hey, I can adjust it a little bit and I can do that good, and that we can improve, then I think that the world will much more appreciate ERP as well, because now it's seen as a big, giant hurdle to get towards the new system, and then we are okay. No, then we're going to start. Then we're going to make really money with this system. And I think that is something which is in the question as well. So you can do some things up front. You have to do something up front. But please keep your eye open. As I said before, it is not a static business case. It is dynamic. Things are changing. So you can make use of that differences.
Yeah, and especially with the rate of change of technology today and the fact that most organizations are moving to cloud-based solutions that are constantly evolving, constantly improving, you have to almost view these projects as not a finite one-time event, but more of a continuous journey. I mean, if you don't do the continuous work, the continuous improvement, the learning, the pivoting, and all that stuff based on the technology you've deployed, you're really wasting a lot of time and value, I would think.
Yeah. I like it a lot because Simon Sinek said we have finite games and infinite games.
Right.
And if you compare that to your marriage or your partnership you have, would you say that you are the winner in that collaboration? You can't. Both should be winners. So there is a conception that we all have projects, and indeed we do need projects. I agree with it. But it are finite state things. And we should look at the infinite part, because the organization will grow, will flourish afterwards. So I think that the infinite, therefore we called it beyond infinity. Have a look at that. If you are value-based on that approach, you can also see it is not the number of functionalities you have, but the usage. And then we can see again that you don't need all the functionality in the world, but you need the right combinations to make the value. And I think that is very interesting part as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm here with Dr. Hans Mulder from University of Antwerp talking about lessons from over 100,000 digital transformation case studies. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
My name is Eric Kimberling, and I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting. Before we dive too far into today's content, I want to invite you to learn a little bit more about Third Stage Consulting, who we are and what we do. We help clients through their entire digital transformation life cycles, beginning with digital strategy, software evaluation and selection, all the way through and including implementation planning, implementation readiness, and the actual implementation itself. We're technology agnostic, so we only represent our clients' best interests. We do not represent software vendors. But having said that, we work very closely with software vendors, all the leading players that you can imagine we've worked with, both in helping clients evaluate and select them, but also in helping clients implement those solutions as well. So we have a very broad, objective, agnostic view of the market that is meant to really represent your interest as you go through your digital transformation. I also encourage you to scan this QR code right here to get access to our resource center. This resource center has a ton of information, a ton of ebooks that are free. You have access to top 10 software rankings, playbooks for how to make your project more successful, guides to change management, YouTube videos, all kinds of stuff that are going to help you through your digital transformation. So I encourage you to scan this QR code to get access to those resources. And please feel free to reach out to me directly to brainstorm ideas about your project. Even if it's just informally, you want to bounce around some ideas and get some informal advice, I'd be happy to spend some time with you. So feel free to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below. You can also find it in the description field of this video as well.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 170. My name is Eric Kimberling here at Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new shows of this podcast every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And this podcast is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting. Thank you for being here today. We're here with Hans Mulder talking about lessons from over 100,000 case studies and some of the research he's done in this field over the years. Here's a question. We haven't really gotten too far into the concept of user adoption, but this is a question from a user on LinkedIn. I don't see the name of the person, but this is from LinkedIn. It says, how would you define the user adoption into the definition of success? And did you include that in your study? So in other words, you looked at satisfaction, you mentioned. Satisfaction was one of the criteria. Right. Was user adoption a separate line item, or was that included within satisfaction, or how did you factor that in?
Well, for, let's say, the database, we had about 122 attributes. This could be categorized, I think, in the direction of, let's say, the satisfaction part. But I think that question is very much more specific. And that is, of course, is in the eye of the beholder, what does the user do with the system? How is the adoption on that level? And I think that is not a quantitative question, but a qualitative question. So what we do see, and that I think very remarkable, is that some users are very creative. And what we call a bug, they call a feature. And so they are much more, and that is what we call the law of, let's say, the users. They could be your best friend, but they could also be your worst enemy in the projects we have seen. So if it's talking about the user adoption, I think it is not only meant about the quantity, like it is used or how many people are using it. It's also about the perception of the adoption. And I think that is a very important indicator for me. Are people really happy? Are they really helped by the system? Are they really thinking, well, wow, this is something which I'm proud of. I'm going to tell it to the other people. So user adoption in that sense, in my opinion, humble opinion, is also more qualitative. And should also have a look at the subjective perspective of how they encounter the system to be valuable for their customers, because they want to do the best thing they can, and also adjustable, so that they are also part of the continuous improvement. So I think it is a very good question, and I cannot answer it on a quantitative basis, but on the quality, I think it is a very early indicator of the value you're going to bring with your projects.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then this is a question from Darian on YouTube. What does the future of this research look like? So in other words, I assume you'll continue this research. You'll add to the 120,000 or 100,000 plus case studies. But how do you see the research evolving and changing over time?
Well, actually, the statistical part, because we had a flat line, we are not very much doing very much more of the same things as well. But where we're looking now is trying to get a more focus group approach on the concept of flow. So I did an invitation on LinkedIn that people who are interested to brainstorm with us and to talk about with us. because I think we are discovery. It is not just there in a very statistical basis. We did write a chapter for a academic book about the digital enterprise, and we found about 5,000 case studies which could be, let's say, representatives of the digital enterprise. So we see that we are now a little bit more to the qualitative side. So we will continue our research, but it will not be statistical. I think it will be much more focus groups. And we try to focus on defining the concept of flow, just to make it more clear that it is just as valuable as waterfall, as agile, but to focus on the current organization. So what we talked about ERP is there, so it is in the operation. That doesn't mean you are not changing anymore. So I think that part we are now much more focusing on the flow-like modernization. And the reason why we are doing that for our research, and it is much more qualitative discovery, is because that rates are even much more impressive and could be a breakthrough to the flat lines we have seen in the last 25 years. So if we're looking at successful flow-like modernization, the average chances are 71% on success. And on challenged, 28% is challenged, but only 1 to 2% is failed, which is very logical again, because you're already using it. And so it is not a miracle, but it is something which is so interesting to see. Can we use that number of that low, let's say, failure rate to be adopted in a flow-like approach? Could we do refactoring when we are working with it? Could we isolate certain parts so that we can don't have to have that big bang boom, because the big bang booms are the ones who are causing the project failures, especially. So one of the famous quotes of my fellow researcher in the US is, if you don't want any project failures, don't do it. So don't do projects.
Right. That's brilliant. I never thought of that. All these years I've been searching for the answer of how to avoid failure, and it was that simple.
Right.
That's a great point, though. I mean, it is true that people have to recognize you are taking risk, and on the flip side, there are things you can do to mitigate and minimize those risks. And I think organizational dynamics and organizational behaviors, they seem to repeat themselves over time. Over years and decades, it seems like it's sort of the technology's changing, agile approaches change, all these different things change. But one thing that doesn't change are some of these mistakes that organizations make, including what you were talking about before about not focusing enough on themselves and like how can they better lead the transformation versus assuming that the right technology or the right technology partner is going to solve that for you. And hopefully organizations will learn that lesson here in the not too distant future, and your research will tell a different story maybe in coming years.
I hope so. I really hope so. I hope that one time I will be obsolete and that we have beautiful transitions from systems, because that means that we have achieved our goals. So I would really love to see a better response on that chances for your digital transformations, indeed.
Right. Absolutely. So just to maybe summarize all your decades in mass amounts of knowledge, if it's possible, I'd like to ask you a sort of a closing summary question here, which is, based on your research and experience, what top 2 or 3 pieces of advice would you leave us all with? If you're going to remember 2 or 3 things from this conversation, what are those things that we should remember in our digital transformation?
Yeah. I think that knowing the people in your team, knowing your good place, and having a good sponsor, that is not only based on data, it's also based on your experience. And if it doesn't feel right, it isn't right. You better start again. So the kill switch up front within about 2 or 3 weeks is beautiful, because you only lose 2 or 3 weeks. So what I would take away is really focus on your, let's say, experience you have with people. And when you say, well, we trust each other, we know that we have the capabilities, the skill set as mentioned, I think then we can look to beautiful times ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great closing advice. And how can people learn about you or connect with you? What's the best way to stay in touch with you here after this conversation?
I'm very much open for discussion, and I'm a very much frequent user of LinkedIn. So LinkedIn would be beautiful to connect. Then I can see also the other side. When I'm doing lectures, for instance, and for new students, executive masters, I'm always looking at my students on LinkedIn. So when I start my lecture, I will say, oh, this is interesting. About 1,000 years of experience is before me. So I have to be very humble. So I would like to connect via LinkedIn, so I can also see a little bit about your background. And like this webinar is beautiful. People from the US, people from Africa, South Africa, Australia. I like really to see a little bit more, because for me, I'm the one who learns the most. Like John Cleese said, the one who laughs the most learns the most. For me, this is very interesting to do. So thank you very much, Eric, for this invitation.
Thank you, Dr. Mulder. Great conversation and really interesting stuff and a lot of great takeaways. I always love to see what the data shows and see how it matches up to my objective and qualitative understanding of the space. So it was really interesting to hear some of those data points. Super interesting stuff, and learn a lot from that conversation. So I appreciate him being here today. Learned so much that we're going to debrief on a couple of the points here in just a moment, and then we're going to bring on, or actually play, another clip of another podcast that I was on recently with Celigo, and we're going to show that clip to you here later in just a few minutes. So be sure to stick around. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Steve, we've chatted before, but remind me and our audience a little bit more about Epicor and where you're focused these days.
Hey, Eric, yep, good to talk to you, and thanks for asking. So Epicor, what we do is we make and sell cloud software for the global supply chain. And when I say that, when a customer purchases our software, we're committed to running their day-to-day business. And this would include everything from finance and procurement to production and sales. It's a responsibility we take very seriously, and it's something I believe we're very good at. We've got an employee base that has the deep expertise to understand their business and run their business. We also compete against 2 or 3 of the largest software companies in the world. So it's not good enough for our products to be good. They have to be consistently great, and that's a really important focus for me. So great products, deep industry expertise. We also focus on the essential workers that make those businesses run. We like to say Epicor's got you covered from the shop floor to the top floor. And when we say that, we really mean it. So that's Epicor.
Your annual Insights User Conference is just around the corner, the Epicor Insights Conference. What are you looking forward to there, and what could we expect to hear about at this conference?
The big thing for me is that we get a lot of what I would call quality time with our customers. And when I say quality time, I mean good old-fashioned, face-to-face, in the same place at the same time, experience with the customers where they tell you what they really think. And in the case of Epicor, we get a lot of great feedback around applications, features, technologies that they love. And in some cases, where we've fallen short. I can tell you that when I think about some of the big projects we've done in the last 7 years that have made the biggest impact on both improving the customer experience, and this would include everything from Prophet 21 and Eclipse, which are distribution products, to Kinetic, which is for manufacturing, to our catalog, which is for automobiles. The feedback that has come directly from our customers at the Insights Conference has had the biggest impact on me. And in many cases, it's resulted in the biggest budgetary decisions I've made to fund projects. So I really appreciate the direct feedback we get. It isn't always fun. It can be a little bumpy, but customers know what they want, and our customers are very deep into their industries. So it's a level of information and intelligence we couldn't get any other way. I always look forward to that. That's the highlight for me.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 170. My name is Eric Kimberling here at Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of the show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. So, Darian, what were your thoughts on this conversation with Dr. Mulder, talking about his extensive research and database of over 100,000 case studies? What were your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I was super excited to see him on the show again. I think I learned a lot from him the first time that we played the clip, and from that interview alone. But then also, this just really dove in deeper into what his case studies really showed. And I think that perspective can kind of, to me, I love looking at data and numbers and all those things. So I think having that perspective of being able to see what does the data actually say for digital transformation case studies, I think that is a really nice perspective to be able to look at from someone that's already looked at, I mean, hundreds of thousands of case studies, which is super cool.
Yeah, I know when we first published that clip of the conversation from a couple weeks ago, some people or some comments were, there's no way there's over 100,000 case studies. It's impossible for someone to have that sort of experience or that sort of data set. But he did a nice job explaining that over 30 years he's been tracking this info and collecting this data in that database. So I think that's super interesting. I've yet to meet anyone that has anywhere close to that much data that they're tracking and analyzing. So super interesting guy for sure.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think having over 30 years really puts into perspective maybe even how much changes over that time from when he first started collecting that data and what the results were showing then for the data versus now after 30 years. What does that data show differently than when he first started, which I think, since it's such a large scale, is such an interesting thing that I don't think anybody else in the world really has that perspective from that much case studies.
Yeah, and I agree, and also, you know, he had very exact metrics that were very telling. Like the one that stood out probably the most was the fact that I think he said 3% of issues related to digital transformations, or 3% of failure, or 3% of the reasons for failure are somehow related to technology, and then the other 97% is non-technological stuff. And I thought that was super interesting because that again sort of fits like what I observe and see and what our team observes and sees with clients. And that's something we talk about a lot in this podcast. So it's interesting to see actual data that backs that and shows scientifically that that is true, that 97% of success or failure has more to do with non-technological issues than it does with technology itself. But yet you look at a budget or the average resource allocation in a digital transformation, and I'd say it's probably 70 or 80% or more focused on technology, but yet that's only 3% related to success or failure. So we're clearly investing our efforts and our resources in the wrong places. That's what that research tells me anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it was super interesting to learn from him. I feel like you could talk for him for hours and learn so much, but it's great to just get it in small bits too.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that because I did talk to him for hours in Amsterdam when I was there a couple weeks ago. He is really fascinating. He's I don't know how his brain isn't full, because when I talked to him, even in that interview just now, you know, he's just got so much knowledge in his head, and he spits out these stats, and I don't know how he remembers them all, but he's got his own little mental database going there too, which is really interesting. So super interesting guy, and yeah, look forward to having him on the show again in the future as well. So great time to shift gears, and we're going to actually roll a clip right now. It's a clip of an interview that I did on a podcast for Celigo, and I'll let you know the interviewer here will describe what Celigo does, but they're a partner of NetSuite's, and they'll describe here in a second what they do in more detail. But this is a really good interview because the interview itself, I thought the questions they asked were really good, and I just really enjoyed this conversation. And we covered a lot of ground too. We sort of did a flyover, almost like a flyover masterclass. You know, here's in just a few minutes or less than an hour, here's all the things that are required to be successful in digital transformations and why they fail, what some of the key success factors are. So we covered a lot of ground in a relatively short period, so we thought it'd be a great clip to play for you. So we're going to roll you this clip from another podcast where I was interviewed, and this is related to just an overview of digital transformation.
Hey everybody, I'm Jordan Tennenbaum. Welcome to the Celigo Technology Leaders Podcast. Today we are joined as always by my co-host Mark Simon, Vice President of Strategy over here at Celigo. And also we have Eric Kimberling. He is the CEO and co-founder of Third Stage Consulting. Eric, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. It sounds like a third stage does, you mentioned the program management, some of the change management, but do you stop short of doing the actual implementation of the specific software itself?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We get asked that quite often, as you can imagine. The way I try to describe it is if you think of an overall program with an overarching PMO, within that, you're going to have different work streams, right? Different technology work streams. So Celigo, for example, if Celigo were a solution being implemented, that might be one work stream. If it was a couple of different ERP systems or CRM or whatever it is, you might have multiple technology work streams. And we don't typically plan that other than to provide that program management overarching support. Where we do overlap or sort of integrate with the services that others provide on the more technical software focused side of things is we'll do the change management behind helping ensure that people understand what the changes are, and helping with user adoption, things of that nature. And then we'll also help re-engineer and optimize business processes too, to ensure that they're not just putting in new technology for technology's sake, but they're actually getting value out of it by adapting their business processes to the technology. And in some cases, adapting the software to meet the business needs. So that's really the way I look at it. Is if you think of an org chart, there's the technology work streams are always filled by someone else, and then all the other boxes on the org chart is where we can help.
Okay, fantastic. That makes a lot of sense. So, and that business process part of that's perhaps the key, and sometimes maybe the biggest overlooked portion of an ERP implementation sometimes. So that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. What does your average customer look like? What size are they? What industries? Get a sense of kind of who you work with on a day-to-day basis.
Sure. So they're mostly mid-market companies or upper mid-market. We've defined our sweet spot as organizations that are between 200 million in annual revenue and $1 billion in annual revenue. Now, having said that, that's sort of the middle of the bell curve. We have some clients that are a lot bigger than that and some that are smaller, but that seems to be the sweet spot. And it's not just company size, it's also complexity. Usually there's a lot of complexity in their business because they're a complex manufacturer or they've gone through a lot of growth, maybe a lot of merger and acquisition type of activity. And now they're trying to figure out how do we combine all this mess that we've gone out and acquired? How do we now create one single company? So there's usually a lot of growth, a lot of complexity, and it's all within the upper mid-market. As far as industry, it's all over the place. There's a heavy concentration of manufacturing distribution clients, but we also work with the education space, as well as financial services and government and some nonprofits, financial services, et cetera. So it really is we're technology agnostic in addition, or we're industry agnostic in addition to being technology agnostic.
Okay. Excellent. Now, one of the things that I've heard over the years a lot, there's I think ERP implementations for organizations have gotten, I wouldn't necessarily say a bad rap, because they can be very impactful on an organization, but certainly maybe a bad rap for there being a notable frequency of failures, so to speak, in industry sometimes. And personally, having had an ERP implementation background in the mid-market, some have these massive successful transformational impacts on orgs, and some, very unfortunately, I haven't seen that many that have failed, but you do see some, and you often see some that don't quite achieve the intent that they intended. I'm curious, because I think with your focus, you must be thinking a lot about this. How do you go about working with your clients and heading those off, whether they're outright ERP implementation failures or just maybe failure to achieve the desired business outcomes? How are you thinking about that and approaching it, essentially?
Yeah, it's a great question. I agree with you, by the way, that you do certainly have those big, massive train wreck failures that are out there, but that's a minority of issues in the market. You hear about it. When a big company fails in their ERP implementation, they're publicly traded, and they have to reveal that information to the street if it's a bigger company. But
makes a lot of noise.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, especially if it's like a Hershey's or a big company that everyone's heard of. But I think the bigger risk is those quieter failures. The under the radar failures that are not complete disasters, but you're leaving a lot of money on the table in terms of business benefits and value creation or value realization. And you spend too much money, too much time, too much headache and chaos within the organization during the implementation. So that's, I'd say the backdrop. But the interesting thing and the good news in this is that it rarely has much to do with the technology, why these projects fail.
It's usually not because the system can't do something. I mean, especially now, I mean, all these systems you can find whatever technology you want. I mean, you're probably not gonna have too much trouble with it, even if it means you have to go, get bolt-ons, or even if it means you can't get one ERP system to do everything, you could still find technology to meet your needs. The bigger challenge is, how do you get value out of it? How do you re-engineer your processes and change the people and make sure that the data is clean, and that you're integrating data across the enterprise and making better decisions? And that's not just going to magically happen because you put new technology in place. And so oftentimes what happens is you put in new technology and you end up doing things the same way you've always done them. And you don't use AI, you don't use machine learning, you don't use some of this automation that you could be using if you just either fought the resistance internally to do so, or just taught people how to use the system better. And so I think that's the biggest thing that plagues the industry, is we focus too much on technology and not enough on, let's look at our optimized business processes, and let's look at how we ensure that the people are actually using the technology the way they could and should.
I think, Eric, you make a really great point about looking at the process. And this is one of the things that I always kind of ran up against a little bit, having spent a lot of time specializing around ERP implementation, was that there's this natural friction, especially if you have a relatively flexible system, right? It's very easy to say, hey, this is how the business operates, and we want the system to conform to this. And sometimes, but there's definitely other methodologies around implementation that take the opposite tack, which is, hey, let's come in and these are the standardized processes and the business should conform to this. And then there's something in between. And I'm curious, how you think about that, as far as where's that dividing line between investing to adapt the software to the business and adapting the business to the software.
Yeah, that's sort of the age-old question. I think it's been an ongoing debate, just like politics or whoever the best sports team is in any given sport. It's like we'll never fully agree on the answer to that. But I think there's a way to get to the right answer, which is, first of all, don't treat all of your business processes equally. I mean, you're going to have different answers for different processes. So I'll take two extreme examples. On one hand, you might have, some very complex engineer to order sorts of needs that you have because you manufacture a complex tailored product, highly engineered. And when you go to a customer or potential customer, you need to know how that product could be built. If I'm a sales rep, I need to know how to build what I can and can't offer to a customer, knowing that I'm not an engineer. So I need a tool in my system that tells me what the parameters are of what I can or can't sell and the configuration I can and can't sell. So that product configuration is really important in an engineer to order manufacturing environment. And so an engineer to order manufacturer in this example might say, hey, that is our secret sauce. The fact that we can create all these different variations of a product for a customer is why we win business. So we are absolutely going to not necessarily just stick with the process we have, but we're not going to water that down. We're not willing to compromise or undermine that. So that might be an area where you say, hey, the software is going to have to work here. It's going to have to fit that process. Yep. But then on the other extreme, you've got accounts payable, invoice processing. Okay, is it really a competitive advantage for you to pay your vendors faster or more efficiently? Yeah, maybe a little bit, but not in the same way that customer-facing, revenue-generating side of it will. So in that case, you might say, whatever the software can or can't do, we're willing to change our business to fit that. Yeah, it might be painful for that group, and that's still a big deal, but that's okay. That's better to change the people in that case than to re-engineer the software to do something that it could already do out of the box the way it is. So you have to sort of bifurcate your processes and say, you've got two buckets. You've got the ones that are secret sauce, critical competitive advantages, and you've got the other ones that are more commodity. Doesn't matter how we do things. It's going to look the same across industries within the same industry, and we can adapt or conform to whatever the software does.
We're playing you a clip of an interview from Celigo where the guest and I get to talk about an overview of digital transformation. We're going to take a quick break and we'll continue the conversation here in just a moment. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control.
My name is Eric Kimberling, and I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting. Before we dive too far into today's content, I want to invite you to learn a little bit more about Third Stage Consulting, who we are and what we do. We help clients through their entire digital transformation life cycles, beginning with digital strategy, software evaluation and selection, all the way through and including implementation planning, implementation readiness, and the actual implementation itself. We're technology agnostic, so we only represent our clients' best interests. We do not represent software vendors. But having said that, we work very closely with software vendors all the leading players that you can imagine we've worked with, both in helping clients evaluate and select them, but also in helping clients implement those solutions as well. So we have a very broad, objective, agnostic view of the market that is meant to really represent your interest as you go through your digital transformation. I also encourage you to scan this QR code right here to get access to our resource center. This resource center has a ton of information, a ton of ebooks that are free. You have access to top 10 software rankings, playbooks for how to make your project more successful, guides to change management, YouTube videos, all kinds of stuff that are going to help you through your digital transformation. So I encourage you to scan this QR code to get access to those resources. And please feel free to reach out to me directly to brainstorm ideas about your project. Even if it's just informally, you want to bounce around some ideas and get some informal advice, I'd be happy to spend some time with you. So feel free to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below. You can also find it in the description field of this video as well.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 170. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can also find past episodes of this show at transformationgroundcontrol.com, so be sure to check that out. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, which is an independent consulting firm that helps clients through digital transformations, and not coincidentally, it's also the company that Darian and I both work for. I'm here playing you a clip from a podcast from another company called Celigo that had me on to talk about an overview of digital transformations. Let's jump back into the conversation.
That's often really the way that I've seen as well to break it down, right? What's differentiating your business and what's not. And if it's not differentiating your business, you shouldn't be customizing around it. You shouldn't be spending a lot of effort and energy and time to modify your system just because maybe that's the way we've always done it, but there's no value from it. And I often see, in mid-markets, really, really interesting. You get some very strong, like polarizing opinions on this in companies that have grown rapidly. Well, it's the way we've done it. And because it's the way they've done it and they've grown fast, often said, well, that justifies maybe a non-optimized business process. But I really like how you think about that. And I think that's really useful and really useful for, anyone working to look at their business. Okay, is this adding value or not? And then rework that. And how do you, in taking that in mind, where you have those customized processes and you see the differentiated business need for that, how do you take that into account in that the preparation for? I think of it as the readiness for the ERP implementation.
Yeah, that's a great question. So every organization has limited time and resources. They're not infinite. So you're not going to be able to boil the ocean, even if you wanted to. You're not going to be able to re-engineer every single process within your business and define everything in super perfect detail. But there's certain parts of your business where you're going to need to. And so in my example, that front customer facing side of things might be one where to prepare. We're going to make sure that we have that really well documented, so we know exactly what the parameters are and how that process works, how the customer experience needs to look for our customers. And that's going to be our blueprint that we are going to present to the technology vendor, the implementer, whoever's doing the technology piece of it, so that, again, the business is driving the technology. And then the vendor comes back and says, okay, now we know how to build the software. And yes, there's going to be discrepancies. Yes, there's going to be gaps and things that the software doesn't quite do the way you want it to. And that's where you make the decision. Is it good enough, or are we watering down the competitive advantage? Maybe we need to customize or to reconfigure, or whatever the case may be. In the accounts payable example, you might just do a tertiary, like sort of high level blueprint. It's more high level that, like, we need to receive a invoice. You do a 3-way match. You set the parameters for approvals, and then you pay the invoices. I mean, I'm oversimplifying, of course, but that's the general process. Whatever the software does within that in terms of workflows, we're probably going to be good. So we're not going to spend too much time defining that in a super great amount of detail. largely because it's not as important or not as high of a priority, but also because we're probably going to change our process anyway to fit whatever the software does. So there's no point in us sort of trying to recreate the wheel or document the current state too much, knowing that it's going to change potentially significantly.
Exactly. And now when we look, when we think about the ERP implementation, there's a word that you mentioned, or two words that you mentioned earlier, digital transformation at the very beginning. And I want to tie this back, ERP implementation, back to digital transformation. I'd love to get your take on, what digital transformation is. I think it's a term that's thrown around a lot. It can kind of be this, a little bit of this management consulting buzzword, so to speak, and a lot of people can because of that can kind of keep it at arm's length and say, well, that's not what we're doing. But I'm curious your take on digital transformation and ERP and really how those relate to each other.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the way I look at it is ERP implementations are one potential tool or work stream that could be part of a digital transformation. Now, for some organizations, the ERP implementation is the kind of the sole focus of the project. But the difference is even in that case is going to be, are we implementing an ERP technology solution or are we going through a transformation? In other words, are we actually going to try and change and improve our business? It may sound like slicing hairs or, getting caught up in words, but words are important, and the word transformation is really the key word that sometimes gets lost when we just focus on an ERP implementation. Especially nowadays where, a lot of these software vendors that didn't start out in the cloud. So, for example, this comment does not apply to NetSuite or Salesforce or Workday customers, but for other legacy customers that have been using on-premise versions of Microsoft Dynamics or SAP ECC or Oracle EBS or whatever the system is, they're being forced in many cases to move to the cloud quickly because the vendors are sunsetting the products and they're going to cut off maintenance in the near future. So a lot of organizations are saying, oh, wow, now I need to do this now. And so they end up in this sort of myopically focused view of I need to replace my technology without thinking about, well, hold on, while we're doing it, why not leverage AI? Why not figure out how we're really going to build AI into our processes and workflows? Because just because we have AI in the system doesn't mean we're going to use it. So let's define how it's going to work in our organization. Mm-hmm. So that's the difference to me is like, are you just going to pave the cow paths and put in new technology to do the same thing? Or are you going to transform, improve your business, look at new ways of doing business, maybe even change your business model, the way you're organized, move to a shared service model where you can consolidate functions and have a standard way of operating? Those are the types of transformative things that organizations tend to get more value out of. Just replacing your technology really doesn't deliver a lot of value. You're switching from an on-prem capital cost now, and now you've replaced it with a subscription ongoing OpEx costs. That's the real change. And of course, there are some incremental improvements no matter what, of course. But you wait back to your earlier point, Mark, you don't want to leave too much on the table in terms of business value. And while you're going through the heartache, the pain, and the cost of implementing, you might as well change your business while you're at it because you don't want to have to go through this again later.
Yeah, and I think you hit on like a really key point, which is what does that, if a business leader is undergoing this decision, whether they're the CEO or CIO, or it's the executive team, they need to ask themselves, well, what do they want out of this? Eric, what are some questions you would want somebody like that to ask themselves or a leadership team to ask themselves to try to figure that out? Because I think a lot of companies don't really know. They're triggered by some external factor. Hey, in order to get the next round of funding, your processes are messed up and your system's limited in X way. And so you need to implement a new, I've seen some of these very hard reasons and they go headlong into it. And it's really not, often that well thought out. They do need a new system, obviously, but maybe the reason it hasn't been examined. And I'm curious how you get your clients, because it seems like you're really at the crux of that. They're bringing you in to think about these things and help them think about how do you get them to think about it differently? How should they think? What are things they should ask themselves in order to do that?
Yeah, I think the biggest question is why. And to your point, oftentimes, I'd say majority of the time when we ask, why are you doing this project? That's the first thing we ask our clients is why are you doing this? Why are you doing it now? Why didn't you do it 2 years ago? Why don't you wait 2 more years? What's driving you to get to this point now?
more often than not, the answer is, well, we have to. And you say, okay, why do you have to? Because we've got old outdated systems, or our vendor's cutting off support in 2 years, so we have to make a change. Okay, that's a fair reason, right? Okay, but what else? That can't be the only reason. And then that's usually where you get the blank look and the blank stare and say, well, that's the reason. Well, that can't be the reason, because that's not a good enough reason to justify and to have clear direction on what you're going to do in the project. And back to your point about failures, companies that do these projects aimlessly just to put in new technology, those are the ones that get into trouble, because they don't have a clear vision of what they're trying to get out of the system. They're certainly don't have a clear vision of how they're going to maximize ROI and business value, let alone, just be successful and implement on time, on a budget. So that's the thing you have to do, is you have to peel back the onion and sort of start at the top with the executive team and say, what's your strategy as a company? What are you doing as a company? And how does this project help you? And you have to force the organization to think that way, because there is a connection. They just may not know it yet. They may not have articulated it yet. It's not simply because they have to put in new technology. Is it because they want to scale the company? They're going through aggressive growth. Okay, now we're getting somewhere when they say that. Or we're operating like 15 different companies. We should be acting like one company. Okay, there we go. Now we're talking about where you're going to get business value and how this technology can better support you. So those are the types of questions you have to ask. You have to get back to the strategy of the company and make sure there's a clear connection between this project and the overall strategy.
Excellent. That's I would certainly that echoes a lot for me from what I've seen in my experience. That definitely makes sense. You mentioned there's something about the timing and you digging into the timing for your clients. When is the right time to implement an ERP? What is it? It's not necessarily, you probably can't compare it to planting a tree necessarily, but how do you figure that out as a company if you're not being driven by one of those external system factors where you're essentially forced into it? But is it better to do it earlier or later? Wait as long as you can. I'm curious to get your take on that.
Oh, that's a great question. The short answer is it depends. I mean, it depends on the situation you're in, but maybe I'll give some different scenarios that might help get to which scenario makes the most sense for an organization. I mean, for some organizations, first of all, there's some prerequisites that I would say, if you don't have these prerequisites in place, then now is not the right time. You should go get these prerequisites first, then move forward with the transformation. So some of those prerequisites include some of the things we've talked about. If your executive team doesn't have a clear vision of what they want out of this project, or that hasn't been articulated to the team, figure that out first, then go look at new technologies and go implement. If you don't have a clear vision of what you want your operational model to look like going forward, how you want your business to change going forward, figure that out first, because otherwise I can guarantee you're just going to put in sexy, cool new technology that does the same exact thing you've always done. It just looks cooler. Maybe it's got some unused capabilities that you could someday use, but you're not using. So you've got to have those prerequisites in place. Your organization has to be ready for it. I mean, obviously there has to be some sort of burning platform. If it's not a software vendor forcing you off the system, it might be that you either are in the midst of, or you see on the near horizon that you are about to break the system, or you just can't scale for growth. That's a good driver, because that means it's easier to get buy-in and momentum behind the idea. So that'd be the first thing, is have those prerequisites in place. And if you don't, wait until you have those prerequisites, then move forward. The other thing I'd say too is if you're in an industry that's being highly disrupted and you're worried about getting crushed by the competition, then you might need to move faster than you think. So if you're in high tech or any industry that's being disrupted, supply chain sorts of related companies, those are organizations that are more ripe for let's do it now. If you're an old established company that's doing just fine, you've got steady eddy growth and there's no real burning platform. Okay, maybe you do something. Maybe it's not as massive or as much of a quantum leap jump as another company might take. So I think that's another key thing, is it's not all or nothing. It's not all or nothing proposition. You don't have to go through an entire transformation. Maybe you just transform your finance department to your supply chain function, or you kind of pick off that low hanging fruit. And then when the other parts of the organization are ready, or when the pain is great enough or the opportunity is great enough, then you move forward with those other areas too. So you've got to really assess the situation, understand, the risk tolerance, the culture of the company, the outside strategic forces, all those things factor into when the right time is.
Okay. That definitely makes sense. You mentioned, kind of at the end, they're doing it in pieces a little bit. We mind expanding on that a little bit? Is it feasible to approach an ERP migration from that standpoint, breaking it out into business functions and spreading that over maybe, let's say, even years, for example?
Yeah, again, for some organizations, it just makes a lot of sense. Maybe they're really risk intolerant. If they're a risk intolerant company that don't do a big, massive ERP project all at once, pick off little pieces and go in piecemeal. That's okay. I mean, a lot of industry analysts and software vendors will say, no, that's a terrible idea. You should just implement one ERP system in one fell swoop. And you have to look at, well, is it because they're trying to sell you one big ERP system in one fell swoop, or is it because that's really what's right for you? And so, yeah, there are downsides to what I'm suggesting. If you're a risk adverse company and you go in piecemeal, you've got to worry about building interim integration points that will go away eventually, presumably. But I think in today's technology landscape, including what Celigo provides, having this platform as a service concept and composable ERP, and knowing that you don't have to go all in on one technology that creates a sort of vendor lock-in, you've got tools out there that allow you to, pull out little pieces of your business and replace the technologies, change your processes. And, eventually you do want to do so in the context of a broader vision, of course, but the way you go about it could be more in piecemeal. And just like anything, there's pros and cons. It might take you longer to get the business value, but you're also probably going to spend less money, and you're certainly going to expose your operations to less risk than if you go through a bigger, more transformative change all at once.
I think that's great advice to somebody out there. I think that's just helpful for anyone that's thinking about this and embarking on a big ERP implementation. Know that they have options, right? That they don't necessarily have to take it all in one bite, because I think that's what you hear 98% of the time. And and then often other big foundational systems getting roped in at the same time. I very often hear, we're implementing our ERP, and we're putting in place a new 3PL vendor, or a new WMS, or a new CRM, or a new manufacturing system of some kind.
We're playing you a clip of an interview from Celigo where the guest and I get to talk about an overview of digital transformation. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll continue the conversation here in just a moment. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. I recently published my first book. It's called The Final Countdown: Strategies to Reach the Third Stage of Digital Transformation. And I wrote this book because I really wanted to find a concise way to share some of my knowledge around digital strategy and how to get started on a digital transformation journey. So in this book, I cover 3 different sections. I cover the people, process, and technology aspects of transformation, with the idea that it's meant to be a starting point, a launching pad for organizations and team members that are going through digital transformations. So I encourage you to buy this book. You can get it electronically, you can get it paperback, or you can get it in hard copy, as I'm holding here in front of you. You can get it by going to thefinalcountdown.com. You can also search for it on Amazon if you shop at Amazon. Otherwise, just go to thefinalcountdown.com. Love to hear your feedback on this book as well. So I hope you check it out and hope you enjoy.
I'm excited to share our newly released 2024 Digital Enterprise Operations Report. This free download is available on the Third Stage website at thirdstage-consulting.com. This report is truly packed full of technology-independent and agnostic insights for your project to ensure that you're strategically optimized for success. Download your copy today with the QR code in front of me, or visit our website for more details.
These things take time, mom and dad, they have a good life. But what am I gonna do with mine?
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 170. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can also find past episodes of this show at transformationgroundcontrol.com, so be sure to check that out. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, which is an independent consulting firm that helps clients through digital transformations. And not coincidentally, it's also the company that Darian and I both work for. I'm here playing you a clip from a podcast from another company called Celigo that had me on to talk about an overview of digital transformations. Let's jump back into the conversation.
And this is a trend I think I know that I've seen, and we've seen at Celigo so much dealing with a lot of mid-market companies, is this move from the ERP being one system covering the majority of the business to being much more of with the proliferation of SaaS applications being a much more best of breed approach through integration. And I think that alone kind of brings us to, certainly the Celigo point of view on things where we're typically brought in is with ERP, a new ERP implementation. It causes companies to revisit or rebuild their integration, which obviously creates questions around integration strategy, what tools they should use, how can they do it better, and where we come in very, very often is at that inflection point of during a new ERP implementation. But I'm curious to get your thoughts a little more on what. How does integration and a good integration tool play into an ERP project, but maybe a little bit more on the broader business solution being delivered through ERP?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a key enabler that is oftentimes overlooked because, it's, if you think about it, we look at applications, you can see it and touch it, feel it. You see the data, you see the screens you're using and stuff like that. But integration, you don't really see it. I can't really demo integration for you. Like I can demo you a finance and accounting system
we can. Don't worry, Eric.
I'm sure you can. I'm sorry, I'm speaking for myself, not for you. But it's funny. No, but it's easier to see and touch and feel an application. But what you're really integrating are business processes. So if you look at your end-to-end processes,
yes,
and then you start to look at all these different systems I'm using. I can't have this integrated end-to-end process unless all these different systems, these colored boxes in my process flow, unless they all tie together and the data flows and all that stuff. And that's where organizations get caught up in silos. I've got silos and handoffs and manual reentry of data when you've got tools out there like what you guys offer that can integrate that. So I think it's super critical. It just gives you so many more options too. And again, it makes you less dependent on software vendors. So yes, you need the software vendors, but now you kind of shift your thinking from a core application being the center stone of the technology to now maybe it's the integration of technologies that's the core center stone. And then you bolt on, whatever technologies you need. And again, the reality is regulatory needs typically require that you have multiple systems to some degree. You've got, most ERP systems can't be everything to everyone. So you're going to have some sort of bolt-on. Chances are pretty high. Even if it's from the same vendor, you're going to have some sort of bolt-on that they're going to suggest because their core software can't do it all. And then you just look at how much the world is changing, how fast technology is changing too. Do you really want to have one big system that's really hard to replace, knowing that your business and technology are all changing so fast, especially now? Whereas that integration tool set and focusing more on the integration creates more opportunity to adjust and be nimble, as you move forward.
Almost sounds like through the use of the right integration tool, you can get more business agility out of it.
Agility, that was actually the word. I knew there was a buzzword that I was missing, and it was agility. So yes, thank you.
I spend too much time using buzzwords in my day-to-day life. But
me too, don't worry.
A lot of synergy going on here, folks.
Yeah,
I like it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's one of the things. So it's Celigo. One of the viewpoints we take for customers is that they need to adopt what we call an automation first mindset. So try to shift from this. Because what we see, particularly in mid-market, and I see this in enterprise as well, is that integration can be very reactionary. Mm-hmm. It's, hey, I've got this core, you've got your core foundational systems, and you get there's this sort of must-have integration that even to get your ERP and your CRM tools up and running, you have to have some integration between those two. It's just, you're not going to launch them without that. And so you can have these core integrations, and those are very common. But then we see a lot of companies, they start adding in SaaS apps, but literally by the dozen these days, right? And you get this proliferation of SaaS apps that are, some of them have native integration, so it gets built in kind of somewhat automatically, but it generally isn't quite right if they use that, some point to point. And ultimately you end up with these silos out there. And then these things breaking, someone coming in or doing a root cause analysis, hopefully a good consultant, they're going to bring in a good consultant, they're going to figure this out and say, hey, you need some more integration here. You need to integrate these systems back in. And we find that to be very reactionary. A company can end up in this situation where they're already sort of implementing something, never quite getting the value. And then going through this process, and it takes some time to figure out, well, why didn't we get the value? Oh, wait a minute. we didn't integrate it properly to the other surrounding systems, and then doing the integration project. And one of the points of view we try to take is get companies to look at this a little bit differently and say, well, if you think about this from a standpoint of how can you automate first? So first question you ask is, okay, we're going to add this system, or we're going to change this process. Oh, can we automate that? Can you, and that's something that we see kind of really shifting the mindset and getting to that end digital transformation concept sooner, without as painful of a road. And I'm curious if you've seen anything in your experience that reinforces that, contradicts it. Do you think that automation first approach is a better way to go, or viable if companies adopt that, in a more widespread or more uniform fashion?
I do. And the reason being is that it forces the organization, or it changes their thinking to do what I was suggesting before, which is have a vision of what you want to be when you grow up, and make sure you've got clearly defined processes, and you know where the hidden business value is within your organization. Your software vendor doesn't know. They might have an idea that you might have told them some of it, but really only your team knows where the unlocked value is and where the inefficiencies are. So if you go in with that clear vision of what you want, and you blueprint it out, like, hey, here's a manual process over here with a lot of rework and manual reentry and data silos that aren't integrated, you sort of highlight that and say, that's something we really need to fix. You circle that on your process map and say, that's our top priority. And then when you go to implement, you say, hey, that's the number one priority, or whatever it is. And all the other stuff's important too, but that's the most important thing. We have to get that right. And that's where the most value is. So it puts a customer in charge too. It makes them responsible for their own transformation versus just, hey, I'm going to go hire a software vendor or a technical implementer. They'll just go put the technology in and it'll solve all our problems, because it's not going to. Everything you just described, I can put tool sets in your organization that can do everything you just said, but it's just going to sit there unless we've figured out a way that we're going to use it, and we've got a strategy for how we're going to use it.
Fantastic. Very good. And this to kind of wrap up the ERP and integration conversation a little bit. I wanted to ask you if, are there any, and there you've dropped a lot of really good nuggets along the way. So I think you can distill the conversation down, and there's a lot of takeaways for a business leader. But maybe to put a sharper point on a few of them, if I was a business leader and I'm listening to this podcast and I'm thinking about implementing in ERP, or we're reaching that point in our company growth, what are the three things, the five things that you would tell me to think about or to consider before I get started?
Yeah, well, I'd say, in no particular order, maybe more sequential than anything, is first of all, make sure you have a clear vision of how this project or how this technology initiative supports your strategy, like we talked about before, and what those integration points are, and how we're going to align this project with what our strategy is as an organization. The other one would be to have a clear vision from our business process perspective, as we've talked about throughout this conversation. One we haven't talked a lot about is just make sure you invest heavily in change management. And if you can't invest or don't want to invest heavily in change management, or you can't get the executives on board with that idea of investing heavily in change management, then don't do it, because it's not going to go well if you don't. I think organizations are starting to mature in this area and understand that change management is important. Certainly, I think they understand it more now than they did 20 years ago or 25 years ago when I started doing this. And then, I think another thing that we haven't talked about is to have realistic expectations. If you want to have a realistic plan for how you're going to deploy technology, along with the process changes, the people changes, the integration, the data migration, all that stuff that goes along with it. And what ends up happening is, customers get bamboozled, for lack of a better word. It's not in a nefarious way or an intentional way, but software sales reps will typically say, hey, company your size, we could probably implement this technology in 12 months or whatever it is. And chances are pretty high they probably could if they wanted to, and they probably can. But the question is, can you change your business fast enough to keep up with that 12-month timeline? And the problem is most organizations can't. And so they draw a line in the sand that says, we're doing this project in 12 months, when really it should have been 18 or 24, whatever the number is. So they had an unrealistic plan to begin with, and then that leads them down a path of a bunch of bad decisions later. They cut change management, they cut that testing cycle, they cut some of the integration. Maybe they won't migrate all the data that they thought they would. And suddenly you're left with an underwhelming ERP implementation that leaves a lot of value on the table. And chances are pretty high you're still going to go over time and over budget because now you're trying to force fit time and money into a box that was never meant to fit in.
That is fantastic guidance. Actually, I think that is really, really good, because if you look at that, if you kind of tie all these things together, if you're not transforming your business, then why do you really have a good reason to be doing this as far as an ERP implementation? So, and if you are transforming your business, you should be asking yourself, why? How long is it really going to take us? How long does the business need? It's not about the hitting the deadline, the getting the system implemented, but how long is it going to take the business to change in order to take advantage of it? And that is fantastic. I really like that. I'm gonna borrow that sometime. Make sure
I got a trademark on it. I'll license it to you. Yeah.
Awesome. One thing I want to ask here, kind of maybe not as directly related to ERP, but one of the things that's very cool about some of the things you do is that you've definitely created. You specialize in thought leadership in a way, right? You're very much a thought leader in the ERP space. You generate a ton of content. You focus on generating high quality content. I'm curious to get your thoughts on what's driven you to do that, and how you use that for your business purposes. What's really kind of behind that, because it seems like you've taken a very unique approach to that, or a differentiated approach, I should say.
Yeah, thank you. And it has been a core fundamental part of our marketing strategy has been to create that thought leadership. And really the reason I started doing it, to be honest, is when I started the company in 2018, I had left the company I had started, I founded and ran for 13 years prior to that. And when I started that company in 2005, I built the whole company and the marketing engine around SEO and blogs and stuff like that, which doesn't sound like anything, and it doesn't sound like rocket science nowadays. But back then in the B2B tech space, there wasn't anyone really doing blogs, SEO, and optimizing Google and all that stuff. So we were one of the pioneers of that. And I built the entire marketing engine, lead generation around that. So when I left that company to start Third Stage, I knew what I did at that previous company. I knew I couldn't replicate it quickly. It's certainly not quickly, especially as competitive as it had gotten in the blog space and the SEO space. And by that point, people were paying for Google rankings, whereas back in 2005, they weren't. So, I knew I couldn't really compete with that, or if I could, it would take years to get the traction I needed. So I looked at YouTube and saw that, well, no one's really making videos about this stuff. And what better way to get a message out rather than just say, hey, we could do software selection, or hey, we can help you define a implementation plan, or we can help you implement and do change management, whatever. Rather than just saying, we said, well, why don't we give some advice on how to do it? And if people like it, they'll reach out to us, they'll call us or whatever. And that's why we did it. So then, of course, once you see it's working, we just kept doubling down on it, and we continue to double down on it. In fact, so we do more and more over time.
Something I will say is, Eric, you make my job a little bit easier when you say things like that, because it is my dream and my goal to have leadership executives across not only Celigo, but just a whole range of companies becoming thought leaders, creating their own content and sharing it, not only because it benefits them and their own brand and their own network, but it helps the company grow tremendously and exponentially. And I think the way that you've done it and positioned yourself and grown your own brand through UGC and interesting content for business users that business users actually care about is really unique, really uncommon, and incredibly effective. So I'm a social media manager, so that's kind of how I heard of you, just seeing your content all around. And so thank you for doing that. And I think it's really important that you do it. And I hope it spreads to, other executives and leaders, because it, in my opinion, is one of the best and most effective ways to evangelize business technology, business processes, things like that.
Yeah, and we all want to do business with people we like. We're human, so you see someone on video, or you kind of it resonates or it doesn't. So we, in my opinion, it's a great way to get your face out there to people that don't know you, but it also it sort of weeds out people that don't like what we have to say. Then great, we're not going to they won't ever reach out to us, and we're not spending time chasing down an opportunity where they just don't like what we have to say. And so it's a great way to qualify. And then also when when clients do reach out, it's really interesting the reaction they have. It's like, I already know you, I already know your company. Don't even tell me about your company or about you. I've watched 10 of your videos, I already know. So, all right, that makes our jobs easier. Now we can just talk about you, the customer, and figure out what your needs are. And it really helps accelerate our sales cycle too.
Leads that come in through thought leadership go through your pipeline 7 to 8 times easier than those that don't. So seems like you're doing something right. And Mark, might be time to create some video content.
Well, yeah, one of the biggest things we see with integration is that where integration projects struggle, it's because of the business, the upstream. So the integration tells you if there's a problem in integration, it's really telling you about something else in the business. So where there's an endpoint implementation problem, where there's a business process breakage, where there's a change management. And one of the things we've done to look at, say, well, how can we make customers more successful? How can we help customers use our platform? It actually so often points back to these other things. It's how to make them more successful actually at their ERP implementation, how to make them more successful at their change management and their business process design. And so, I've looked out there, and there's not a lot of great content, especially unbiased content, on how to go about this, particularly for mid-market companies. It's hard. There's not a lot of good guidance out there, and some of the stuff you're putting out there is really great. And honestly, I've looked at that and said, wow, we should direct some of our customers towards this, because this will set them on the right path to success with our, and it's, in the end, self-serving, but it's all aligning businesses how to be more efficient, how to work better, how to be more successful in their projects. So it's really great to see interesting and unbiased content out there around this type of stuff, because there's so much to weed through that is from the vendors themselves. So it's like, okay, who's out there talking about how to accomplish this in a more unbiased and not in a fashion that's not tipped one way or the other artificially.
Yeah, and it's in my opinion, it's great to know that a software vendor is in the upper right quadrant of Gartner's Magic Quadrant, right? That's great. That's a good data point. But what about the things that software doesn't do well? What about the weaknesses of that technology? Not because I want to create doubt within an organization, because it's those weaknesses, those deficiencies, or those trade-offs you're making as an organization that lead to risk and problems. And if I cover those, if I just bury those and say, yeah, don't worry, that's not a big deal, and a client goes in with those unrealistic expectations I talked about, that's how they get into trouble. And so, this industry, I think, has a problem where we're so focused on selling software that we're not focused on selling a customer result. And those are two different things. Mm-hmm. And sometimes to sell software, you've got to point out the deficiencies. And in fact, I've seen some sales reps that'll do that. They'll say, here, this software is not really good at this, and you probably want to go find another bolt-on or something. Overall solution is great, but here's a weakness here. And customers really appreciate that. Suddenly now you've built trust. Like, okay, I trust you. You're not lying to me and just tell me how great everything is. And so, that's part of what we do too, is we say, hey, you need to know what the weaknesses are, because that's what could derail your project. And if you don't know what you're going to do about it, then you've got a problem. So let's figure out what you're going to do about it. It's not saying don't buy the software necessarily. It could mean that, maybe we're going to have to go through a painful process to change our processes, or we're going to have to customize that software or integrate it to another system or whatever it may be.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's almost always a solution there, but it's much different knowing about that at the beginning of the project than it is halfway through when you're trying to go live.
Yeah, and you're already burning through budget faster than you hoped, and now all of a sudden you run into this problem and you weren't ready for it. You told the board we're going live in 90 days, and oops, now we've got a big speed bump we've run into. That's not the time to be running into those big showstoppers. All right, that was a great clip and a really interesting conversation and really awesome questions. I thought the podcast producers there, whoever put those questions together, did a great job of covering a lot of ground and making that a really interesting conversation. What were some of your thoughts from the conversation, Darian?
Yeah, I thought, like you said, it was a lot of information about digital transformation, and I think that you can take a lot of good things from that and learn from it. And it's kind of interesting to see from a different perspective. Usually you're doing the interviewing and you were getting interviewed this time more so. So it's interesting to see that perspective too, and get to hear more hard questions that people want to ask you. So that was a cool perspective to see as well on this video. Some questions I have from it though is, I know you talked about measuring success for traditional metrics like cost and and timeline for digital transformations are obviously given metrics that you measure, but what else besides that do you measure to see if a project is successful?
Well, I think, there's sort of two sets of metrics. One is going to be related to the implementation itself. Are we on time? Are we on budget? That sort of thing. But I think the more important metrics are going to be, how does it affect our business? Because, as we talked about with Dr. Mulder earlier in this episode, he talks about how, the classic program, or the classic Project Management Institute, or PMI, definition of project success would be on time and on budget, and the appropriate amount of resources allocated to the project. It's more focused on the sort of the inputs of the project and making sure that all that's managed, and that's important. You've got to do that. But what's even more important, what has even a more material impact on organizations, is the stuff that happens after the project. So when the software goes live in production and beyond, that's where the real definition of success, in my opinion, should come. So in other words, if you finish on time, on budget, everything looks great from a project management perspective, but you don't get any business value, or worse yet, you disrupt the business operations like we talked about earlier with Southwest Airlines, then that I would consider a failure. Yeah, you finished on time and on budget, that's great, but it's really not great because you screwed up the business, or you caused customer issues, production issues, couldn't run payroll, couldn't close the books, all these other issues. So that to me is a dramatic failure, even though you might look at the project management and say, well, at least we finished on time and on budget. Well, it doesn't matter because you cost the business a lot more than that, in the post-implementation world. So those are the main metrics I'd look at, is what kind of business value, measurable business value and actual business value, are you getting out of the system? And unfortunately, most organizations can't answer that question at all, or if they can answer it, they can't answer it positively.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. You don't want all the other sides of the business are, if not more important than staying on time and on budget, because you have to make sure the business can actually run after you implement the new software. My other question from this interview was, you mentioned the importance of the why behind the project and making sure the company knows their why behind the project. What are some common pitfalls that companies face when they lack clarity on their project objectives, or they don't get that why up front?
Well, that's a great question, because if they don't have the why, I mean, a couple things happen. One is at the grassroots level, the organization itself isn't bought into the project. They aren't going to buy in and support the project and be on board with it and give effort to make sure it's successful, because they don't understand why we're doing this. So that's important from sort of a front line level perspective. But even more fundamental, even before that, as you get into the project itself and the core project team, the project manager, the subject matter experts that are contributing to and making decisions on the project, if they don't have the why figured out, or they don't have that understanding, they're going to have a lot of trouble making decisions on the project, because there's so many different directions you can go on a digital transformation, different technologies you can deploy, different ways you can change your business processes, different ways you can change your people and the way you're structured as an organization. And if you don't have that clarity of what we're doing here, then you're just going to be shooting in the dark, which will probably lead to a couple different things. One would be you end up implementing something that's not aligned with what the executive team and the organization needs. The second and even worse thing would be you end up just going with the path of least resistance and just basically automating what you've always done, because you have no sense of why, you don't have that direction of what you're trying to accomplish. And if you don't have that direction from the top of the organization, the bottom of the organization is going to end up driving it, because they're going to say, well, let's just go back to the way we've always done things, because that's what I know, that's what I understand, that's what I'm comfortable with. So the one or both of those options are typically what happens if you don't understand the why. So it's really important to make sure you define it and make sure that the entire organization understands not just the big, really high-level picture stuff like, hey, we're doing this to save money, or hey, we're doing this to be more future-proof. Okay, well, what does that mean? I mean, you have to define it for your organization, the specific goals and objectives you're trying to accomplish and things you want to get out of this project. And once you have that, then that helps mitigate some of the risks that I talked about there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was overall a great conversation with them. And like I said, super interesting to see the perspective of you kind of getting in the hot seat for once.
Yeah, the tables have turned for sure. And that was a great conversation. I appreciate the opportunity to be on that episode. And yeah, great guest here today. I appreciate Dr. Mulder being here today as well. I appreciate the audience questions here. And we've got some great episodes coming up. Next week on episode 171, we're going to get into sort of an overview of smart factories in Industry 4.0, Industry 5.0. So be sure to stick around for that. In episode 172, in 2 weeks, we're going to cover Industry 4.0 again, but with a different guest. So we've got back-to-back episodes here getting into some manufacturing-related technologies the next 2 weeks. And then later this season, or later as the year progresses here, we're going to get into change leadership, platform as a service, supply chain management, a best of episode, business consolidation, integration. Lots of different topics coming up here. A lot of great guests, and we're trying to up the ante on our topics covered, as well as the guests we bring on as well. We're constantly trying to find new faces and voices to share their perspectives. So be sure to stick around and keep an eye on future episodes, which you can find at transformationgroundcontrol.com. So thank you for being here today. Hope you have a great week, and we will see you next time.